She heard the laughter before she even reached her table. 3 women stood near her market stall bonnets, straight, gloves clean, voices carrying like they wanted the whole square to hear. One of them reached out and deliberately knocked Hester's last pie to the ground. Just tipped it off the edge with 2 fingers. Casual. Like brushing away a crumb. Nobody's buying from her anyway, the woman said. Why does she even bother coming? The pie hit the dirt. Crust cracked open. 8 hours of work, and what little flour she had left that week, split apart in the dust of a Wyoming's Saturday morning. Hester stood still. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She had learned that when you have nothing left, you protect what little dignity remains. But somebody else was watching. Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling at something in your chest, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Stories like Hester's about ordinary people surviving impossible things they deserve to be heard. Drop your city or country in the comments below so I can see just how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. Now let's go back to Dustmere, Wyoming, and the morning that changed everything. The pie had taken her the better part of the previous night to finish. Not because Hester Bellamy was a slow baker. She had been baking since she was 9 years old, standing on a wooden crate beside her mother's stove in a cramped Ohio kitchen, learning how to read dough the way other children learned to read books. By the time she was 12, she could feel the difference between butter that was too cold and butter that was just right. By 15, she could tell whether a crust would hold or crumble just by the sound it made when she pressed it. No, the pie had taken all night because she had run out of lard and had to substitute with drippings saved from the week before, and because the apples she'd managed to trade for weren't the variety she needed, and because her hands had ached so badly from the cold that she'd had to stop twice and press them flat against the stovepipe just to get the feeling back. She was 31 years old, and her hands already felt like they belonged to someone much older. That was the kind of detail she never shared with anyone in Dustmere, Wyoming. Nobody here knew that she'd had a husband 8 months ago, a good, quiet man named Thomas who had gotten his boot caught in a harrow during the second week of the harvest and hadn't lived to see the end of the day. Nobody much cared either. Frontier towns had their own supply of grief. One more widow didn't change the arithmetic. And nobody knew that the baby she'd been carrying when Thomas died, the little boy who had come 6 weeks too early in the middle of a January ice storm, had lived for 4 days. 4 days of breathing and struggling and tiny impossible fingers that wrapped around her thumb, and then nothing. She had buried him beside Thomas in the frozen ground, and she had not spoken of him since. What Dustmere knew about Hester Bellamy was this: she was a widow who sold baked goods at the Saturday market. She was quiet in a way that made people uncomfortable, and she wasn't selling enough to cover her rent. The last part was the one that mattered most to them. She set up her table before sunrise, the way she always did, while the rest of the square was still dark and the other vendors were still unloading wagons. She liked the quiet of those early minutes. She liked arranging her bread loaves in rows, adjusting the cloth she used as a tablecloth, lining up the small paper squares she used to wrap cookies. It was the only part of the market day that felt like it belonged entirely to her. Most of its windows were dark. By 7 in the morning, the square had filled up and the familiar cold had settled in behind her shoulder blades, the cold that came not from the air but from being looked through. Women she had tried to greet in the early weeks of her widowhood had long since stopped returning the gesture. Men who bought from other vendors walked past her table without slowing. She had stopped being invisible to them. Invisibility would have been a relief. Instead, she had become a kind of fixture present, noted and quietly dismissed. She was wrapping a loaf in brown paper for a traveler who had stopped without seeming to realize he was stopping, drawn in by the smell, she suspected, because nobody in Dustmere was drawn in by anything else when she heard the 3 women arrive. She knew their voices before she looked up. Ruth Garter, Ida Plume, and a woman everyone called Miss Carlin, who had a first name that nobody used. They were the kind of women who had organized themselves into a permanent social committee decades before any formal committee existed. They decided who mattered in Dustmere and in what order, and they had decided very early that Hester Bellamy mattered approximately as much as mud on a church step. Ruth was the one who knocked the pie off the table. She did it without breaking her stride, without looking directly at Hester, and without lowering her voice. 2 fingers, a slight sideways motion, and the pie was gone. Hester heard it hit the dirt before she fully processed what had happened. Nobody's buying from her anyway, Ruth said to Ida, as though commenting on the weather. Why does she even bother coming? Ida made a small sound of agreement. Miss Carlin didn't respond at all, which was its own form of agreement. Traveler, who had been reaching into his coat for coins, looked at the pie on the ground, looked at the 3 women, looked at Hester, and then quietly withdrew his hand and walked away. He didn't want to be involved. Nobody ever did. Hester stood very still. The pie was ruined. She could see the crust split from where she stood. The filling had pushed through the break and was already collecting dust. She thought, in a detached and clinical way, about the apples, about the lard she hadn't had, about her hands pressed against the stovepipe in the dark, thought about her rent, which was due in 11 days. She did not cry. She had not cried publicly since Thomas died, and she had made a quiet decision somewhere in those first terrible weeks that she would not give Dustmere that particular thing. They had already taken enough. She picked up the pie. She set what remained of it back on the table. She smoothed her apron. She went back to standing behind her goods with her hands folded in front of her and her face in the expression she had learned to hold. Not a smile, because a smile would have looked desperate, but a kind of patient neutrality that said she was still here. She was still open for business, and she had not been undone. She had been undone, of course, but she'd gotten very good at not showing it. The market continued around her. Somewhere to her left, a man was arguing about the price of feed. A child was crying about something near the general store. The smell of coffee drifted over from the establishment across the square, and for a moment Hester allowed herself the small cruelty of breathing it in, because she hadn't been able to afford coffee in 6 weeks. That was when she heard the horse. Not a pleasant sound, not the easy trot of someone arriving for market day. This was a hard ride, the kind that comes when someone is desperate or late or both. The square parted slightly, the way people do when they sense something is wrong without knowing what it is yet, and Hester looked up from her ruined table. The man who stopped his horse in the middle of Dustmere's main square was not someone she had seen before. He was broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his late 30s, with the kind of face that had been weathered by too many years of doing difficult things outdoors. His coat was dusty, and his jaw was set in a way that suggested he had been holding something together by sheer force of will, for longer than anyone should have to. He was holding a child in front of him on the saddle. A little girl, 4 years old maybe, dark hair, eyes that looked at nothing in particular. She sat against the man's chest, the way a doll sits, not resisting, not leaning in, just there, just existing in a way that had very little to do with living. Hester recognized something in that child before she knew the child's name or her story or anything else about her. She recognized it the way you recognize a language you haven't spoken in years, but that lives somewhere in the back of your body. That particular kind of stillness, that quality of having turned something vital off because the alternative was too much to survive. The man climbed down, keeping the girl against him, and looked around the square with an expression that Hester could only describe as a man running out of road. His name was Gideon Rusk. She would learn that later. What she saw now was a father who was frightened in the specific and terrible way that capable men become frightened when they encounter something that none of their capability can fix. He carried his daughter to the nearest food vendor, a man who sold cured meats and hard cheese, and tried to get her to take something. The girl didn't move, didn't look at the food, didn't look at the man offering it. He tried the bread vendor on the other side of the square. Same result. He tried a woman selling dried fruit. Same result. Hester watched him work his way around the perimeter of the market with the slow, terrible patience of someone who had clearly been doing this for a very long time and was very close to the end of something. She watched the vendors try things, soft voices, colorful displays, small samples held out at child's eye level, and she watched the little girl refuse all of it with the simple passivity of someone who had decided, somewhere deep and wordless, that participating in the world was no longer something she was willing to do. She saw Ruth Garter approach him with the practiced concern of someone who wanted to be seen being helpful. She watched Ruth kneel down in front of the little girl and say something, probably something kind, probably well-intentioned, Probably the right kind of words in completely the wrong order, and watched the child's eyes simply slide past her as though Ruth were made of glass. She didn't think too hard about what she did next. She didn't make a plan. She picked up one of the star-shaped butter cookies from the tray at the end of her table. The good one, the one she'd pressed with a cutter Thomas, had given her the first Christmas they were married, and she walked out from Shanchin up behind her table. She didn't walk toward the man. She walked toward the girl. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just crouched down, which put her at the child's level, and waited. The little girl's eyes didn't move to her right away. That was fine. Hester had learned from experience she had never wanted and would never have asked for that grief doesn't come when you call it. You have to sit down beside it and wait. She held the cookie out, not at the girl's mouth, not the way you'd offer a treat to someone you expected to take it. Just out at a neutral angle, the way you might set something on a table. Here, if you want it. No pressure, no watching. She looked slightly to the side while she waited. She counted to 10 in her head. Then she counted to 10 again. The market had gotten very quiet. She was aware of that, the way you're aware of a sound stopping not actively, but somewhere underneath everything else. The little girl looked at the cookie, just looked at it for a long moment, and then she reached out and took it. She didn't eat it right away. She held it in both hands and turned it slightly, like she was examining something she hadn't decided about yet. Then slowly she brought it to her mouth. She took a bite, small one. The kind of bite you take when you're not sure you're allowed to want something. The sound that came from Gideon Rusk behind her, she would think about that sound for a long time afterward. It wasn't a word. It was the sound of something releasing, a pressure that had been building for a very long time. Hester didn't stand up. She stayed at the girl's level and said, very quietly, I made those this morning. They're a little more butter than they should be, probably. The girl took another bite. That's all right, she said. Not to the girl in particular, just into the space between them. I always put in too much butter. She heard Ruth Garter's voice behind her, something low and sharp, directed at Ida Plume, and she heard the words, couldn't possibly, and what does she know? And the tone of someone trying to reclaim a narrative that had slipped away from her. She heard Gideon Rusk's voice override all of it, flat and final. She just got my daughter to eat. None of you did. Silence. Real silence. The market square kind that happens when enough people hear something that cuts through all the noise of ordinary life and makes them stop and acknowledge, even if only for a second, that something important just happened. Hester finally stood up. She didn't look at Ruth. She looked at the little girl who was finishing the cookie with careful attention of someone rediscovering something they'd forgotten they knew how to do. Her name is Nell, Gideon said. He had come to stand beside her, close. The way a man stands when he's running low on pride and doesn't care who sees it. She hasn't been right since her mother passed. That was 7 months ago. I've had the doctor out twice. I've tried everything he told me. She eats maybe enough to stay breathing and not a thing more. Hester looked at Nell. The little girl had finished the cookie. She was looking at the empty space in her hands where it had been, with an expression that was almost not quite, but almost something like surprise. How old is she? Hester asked. 4. She'll be 5 in February. Hester nodded. She had known she was approximately 4. She had also known, without being able to say how, that this wasn't a child who was sick. This was a child who had shut something down because keeping it open had hurt too much. She's not broken, Hester said. I want you to understand that. She's grieving. They're not the same thing. Gideon was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality, something underneath the words. Can you help her? Hester looked at Nell, who was now watching her, with eyes that were still quiet, but not quite so absent, not quite so gone. She thought about her rent. She thought about 11 days. She thought about the ruined pie on her table and the 6 weeks without coffee and the stack of she'd counting and recounting in the hope that they would somehow add up differently. She thought about Thomas. She thought about 4 days and tiny fingers. She said, I can try. It wasn't the most reassuring answer. She could tell from the way Gideon's expression shifted that he'd been hoping for something more solid. But she didn't have anything more solid to offer. And she had learned that promising things she couldn't guarantee was a luxury she couldn't afford not with a child like this. Nell tugged on Hester's apron. It was the smallest gesture, almost nothing. The kind of thing that could have been accidental, but it wasn't accidental. And they all knew it, and Hester looked down at the little girl who had not spoken to anyone in weeks. This, she would learn later. But she already suspected it and saw something as in Nell's face that she recognized from her own mirror in the darkest months after January. The look of someone who desperately wanted to come back, but needed someone to show them. Road was still there. "I'll come tomorrow," Hester said. "If that's all right." Gideon Rusk looked at his daughter. Then he looked at Hester with an expression that had nothing to do with politeness or transaction. "That's more than all right," he said. She went back to her table and stood behind it for the rest of the market day. She sold almost nothing else. Ruth Garter made a point of walking past twice more without stopping. The traveler who had retreated when the pie fell never came back. But Nell sat on the horse in front of her father, at the edge of the square, and twice Hester counted, the way she counted things she was afraid to trust. The little girl turned her head and looked across the market to where Hester was standing. Twice. Like she was checking to make sure she was still there. That evening, alone in her rented room above the tannery, Hester sat at the small table by the window and counted her coins for what she knew was the last time they would add up, the way they had been adding up. She stacked them. In the careful way, she'd developed a habit, almost a ritual, and she looked at what she had left, and she made herself be honest about what it meant. She needed this. She also needed it to be about more than what she needed, or she wouldn't do it right. She thought about the cookie in Nell's hands. She thought about the expression on the little girl's face as she ate that specific quality of someone being surprised by their own hunger. Thought about what it meant to forget that you were allowed to want something. She thought about Thomas's cookie cutter pressed into tin in the shape of a star. She packed her good apron and her recipe tin and the 3 things she knew she'd need for the morning, and she went to sleep before the doubt could catch up with her. Tomorrow she was going to Ironwillow Ranch. She didn't know yet what she'd find there. She didn't know about the frozen kitchen or the dead garden or the silence that had settled over everything like snow, that nobody had gotten around to shoveling. She didn't know about the months Gideon had spent keeping cattle alive while the house fell quiet around him, or about the way Nell sometimes sat at the window for hours watching the road with her mother's shawl around her shoulders. She didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was that a little girl had taken a cookie from her hand when she'd taken nothing from anyone else, and that however small, however uncertain, felt like a place to begin. The road to Ironwillow Ranch was longer than Hester had expected, and the morning was colder than it had any right to be for the middle of September. She had borrowed a wagon from old Pete Sully, who ran the livery and who had known Thomas, and who had, without making anything of it, told her the horse was fed and ready when she arrived at 5:30 in the morning. He hadn't asked where she was going. She hadn't explained. That was the kind of transaction she appreciated, clean, no weight attached to it. The land out this way was open in a manner that could feel either peaceful or punishing, depending on what you brought to it. This morning Hester brought a tin of recipes, a good apron, a small bundle of baking supplies she'd assembled from what little remained in her pantry, and 8 months of experience living inside a silence she hadn't chosen. The hills rolled out ahead of her in the gray early light, and she kept her hands steady on the reins and her eyes on the track. She almost turned back twice, not because she changed her mind, but because the doubt, the particular breed of it that lived inside her chest and had lived there since the January ice storm, had a way of getting louder when she moved towards something that mattered. It was the kind of doubt that dressed itself up as practicality. You don't know these people. You have no business being out here. You are not the right person for this. It knew how to sound reasonable, and she had learned, the hard way, that reasonable-sounding doubt was the most dangerous kind. She kept driving. The ranch appeared on the far side of a shallow rise, and she pulled back slightly on the reins without meaning to, just for a second, because the sight of it stopped something in her. She had expected, she wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something that looked like grief from the outside, maybe. But Ironwillow didn't look grief-struck. The fences were intact. The outbuildings were solid. The cattle she could see in the far pasture were healthy and well-positioned. From a working standpoint, someone had been keeping this place alive with discipline and considerable effort. But the house itself, it wasn't falling apart. It was clean enough. It was structurally sound. But there was something about it, the way the curtain sat, or didn't sit, the angle of a shutter that had come slightly loose and not been tended to, the garden plot beside the east wall that had been left to go to weeds, that told her what she already suspected. Someone had been keeping the ranch alive while allowing the home to slowly stop being one. She understood the distinction entirely. Gideon was in the yard when she pulled up. He had clearly been up for hours. His coat was dirty at the hem, and he had the look of a man who had done 3 hours of outdoor work before breakfast and was now standing in front of his house, wondering if the thing he'd asked for was actually going to arrive. He looked at her wagon with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Relief was part of it. Apprehension was another part. And underneath both of those, something that looked like embarrassment, the kind that comes when you've let someone see your house before you've had a chance to straighten it. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said. "Mr. Rusk." She climbed down before he could move to help her, because she'd learned that accepting help with small things sometimes created expectations around larger ones. "Where is she, kitchen?" He paused. "She came down on her own this morning. That's not nothing. Usually I have to go up." "Did she eat?" "Half a biscuit." "I counted." She looked at him when he said that I counted, and she saw on his face exactly what those words cost him. A man who ran a cattle ranch and managed hired hands and made decisions all day long, reduced to counting half biscuits and treating them like victories, which they were. But knowing they were victories and being able to hold that knowledge without it breaking something in you were two entirely different things. "Half a biscuit is real," she said. "Don't discount it." He nodded. Then, like he needed to say it before she went inside, "She doesn't talk much. She has not since Clara. Since her mother." He stopped. Started again. "The doctor says it's a kind of shock, that she'll come out of it. But it's been 7 months, Mrs. Bellamy, and some mornings I look at her, and I can't." He stopped again. His jaw tightened. "I just need her to come back." "I know," Hester said. She picked up her tin and her bundle and walked toward the house. The kitchen was at the back. The kitchen was at the kitchen, that it was the kind of had once been the center of something. Feel that immediately, not from any particular feature, but from the proportions of it, the way the table was positioned, the hooks near the door, where things had clearly once hung in regular use. Someone had cooked real meals in this room for a long time, and the room still held the shape of that, even though the warmth was gone. Nell was sitting at the table. She was wearing a dark wool dress that was slightly too big for her, and her hair had been brushed but not braided, and she had her hands flat on the table, the way a child will do, when they've been told to sit still and have been sitting still for long enough that they've forgotten they were told. She wasn't looking at anything in particular. Not the window, not the door, just the middle distance that grief-hollowed people learn to inhabit when the world has gotten too loud and too sharp and too full of expectations they can't meet. She looked up when Hester came in, not with surprise, not with hope, more with the watchful assessment of a small animal that has been approached too many times by too many people and has learned to wait and see before deciding anything. Hester set her tin on the counter. She set her bundle beside it. She took off her coat and hung it on an empty hook by the door, as though she belonged here, as though this were a normal thing she did on normal mornings. Then she turned to Nell and said, "Good morning." She didn't ask how she was feeling. She didn't say it was nice to meet her, because it wasn't their first meeting, and pretending otherwise would have been an insult to the child's memory. She didn't comment on how quiet she was, or how thin, or how pale. She just said good morning, the way you'd say it to anyone, and then she turned to the counter and began unpacking her tin. She heard Nell's chair shift slightly, not away. Just a small adjustment, the way a person shifts when something in their environment has changed, and they are recalibrating. Gideon stood in the doorway for a moment. Hester looked at him briefly, and Hester communicated something. It was the kind of look that communicated something without requiring words. "You can stay. But let me work," and he gave a single nod and went back outside. She started with bread, not because it was complicated or impressive, but because bread required time and patience, and filled a kitchen with a smell that was not demanding. It didn't ask anything of the people who breathed it in, just existed. She measured flour without rushing, and she hummed while she worked, not a song exactly, more the musical shape of nothing in particular, and she did not look at Nell while she did it. She had learned in those terrible early weeks after Thomas and then after the baby, that being watched while you are trying to survive something is one of the worst things. Everyone watching to see if you cry. Everyone watching to see if you eat. Everyone watching to see if you were going to be all right. As if all right were a destination you arrived at on a fixed schedule. She had hated it. She had felt more alone under all that watching than she ever had in actual solitude. So she didn't watch Nell. She heard the chair shift again, a small scrape, and then a pause. "What are you making?" The voice was so quiet that for a moment Hester wasn't sure she'd heard it correctly. Small, rough, from disuse. But there, she kept her eyes on the dough and kept her voice exactly as casual as it would have been talking to herself. "Bread, to start. Then I thought I might do something with those apples I see over there, if nobody's claimed them. Silence. Then nobody uses them. They're good apples. Be ashamed to waste them." Another pause. Mama used to make apple cake. Hester's hands slowed just slightly in the dough. Just for a half second. Then she kept going. What kind? The kind with the crumble on top, or the kind she'd put in with the batter? Crumble kind. A beet. She put cinnamon on it. "So do I," Hester said. "That's the only way worth making it." She didn't look up. She didn't comment on the fact that Nell had spoken. She didn't treat the words like the miracle they were, because treating them like a miracle would have made Nell aware of how significant the act was, and awareness of significance had a way of shutting things back down. She just kept working. By the time the bread was set to rise, Nell had moved from the table to standing near the counter. Not close. Enough that she could see what Hester's hands were doing, but not so close that it committed her to anything. Hester slid the bowl toward her, the one with the apples she'd quartered, and handed her the small paring knife, with the handle facing outward. "Those need to be thinner," she said. "Not too thin. About like that one there." She pointed to a slice she'd already cut. Then she went to check the bread. Nell picked up the knife. She was awkward with it, at first unpracticed, the way children are, and she cut too thick on the first two, and Hester didn't correct her. On the third, she caught herself and adjusted. On the fourth, she had it right. "That one," Hester said, passing by. "Like that." Nell looked at the apple slice in her hand with something that might, in better light, have been the very distant beginning of satisfaction. When Gideon came in at mid-morning to check, she knew he was checking. Though he framed it as needing water, he stopped in the doorway and went very still. Nell was at the counter beside Hester, pressing crumble topping onto the apple cake with the heel of her palm. Her dress had flour on it. She was concentrating. Gideon looked at Hester with an expression she wasn't able to fully read and didn't try to. She just tilted her head, almost imperceptibly, toward the door, and he backed out without a word. She heard him on the porch, and she heard something in the rhythm of his footsteps that told her he had sat down on the steps, and she suspected that he put his face in his hands for a moment and stayed there. She let him have that. Lunch was the bread and some beans she'd found, and some dried beef she'd asked Gideon about, and been waved toward, and she made it simple, and she made it without ceremony, and she sat down at the table and ate her own portion, while Nell sat across from her. She didn't watch the child eat. She ate her own food, and she talked intermittently about nothing consequential, about the horse she'd borrowed, about the road in, about how the light out here was different from town light, wider somehow. Nell ate most of her beans, all of her bread. Hester noted it the way she noted everything with her peripheral attention, the way you monitor a fire. Enough to know it's there, not enough to make it self-conscious. Gideon, when he came in for his own lunch, sat down across from his daughter and looked at the nearly empty bowl in front of her, absolutely nothing. His throat moved. He picked up his spoon and started eating. Hester thought that was exactly right. She came back the next morning. And the morning after that, the routine was not dramatic. It was just a routine. She arrived before the household was fully awake. She started the kitchen. She gave Nell something to do that required hands and attention. She ate alongside them without making food the subject of conversation. She left in the late afternoon. The fourth morning, she arrived to find Nell already downstairs, sitting on the bottom step in her nightgown, with her mother's shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Shawl was dark blue wool with a fringe that had been partially worn away along one edge, and Nell held the fringe between her fingers the way a much younger child holds a blanket. She looked at Hester when she came in, and she said, I couldn't sleep. That happens, Hester said. Were you ever scared at nighttime? Nell asked. She said it the way children ask serious questions directly, without understanding or caring that it was a personal question. Hester set down her bag. She thought about the honest answer. I still am sometimes, she said. The dark is quiet in a way that's hard to fill up. Nell nodded, as though this confirmed something she'd been trying to work out on her own. I put Mama's shawl on my bed, she said. It helps a little. Good, Hester said. Hold on to what helps. She went into the kitchen and started the stove. Most of its windows were dark. A few minutes later, she heard the bottom step creak, and then small feet on the floorboards, and then Nell was in the kitchen doorway, still wrapped in the shawl. Can I help? Yep, Hester said. Come stir this. That morning, Nell ate a full breakfast. Not more than she needed, not forced, just full. The bowl empty in the way a bowl gets empty when someone eats without thinking too hard about the act of eating. Gideon saw it and said nothing. But when he passed Hester on the way out to the barn, he stopped for a moment with his back to her and said, quietly, to the door frame, thank you. She said, she's doing it, not me. He went out without responding, but she saw the set of his shoulders change, just slightly, in a way she understood. The crisis happened on the 8th day. She hadn't planned to be there at that hour. It was later in the afternoon than she usually stayed, and she'd remained because a second loaf of bread had burned, and she'd wanted to start another and see it through. Gideon was in the far pasture. The house was quiet. She was in the kitchen when she heard the sound from upstairs. Not crying. Something before crying, the specific silence that is actually the suppression of something that can't be suppressed much longer. She had made that sound herself, alone in her room above the tannery, on more nights than she could count. She went upstairs. Nell was sitting on the floor of what had clearly been her mother's room, which Hester had not been into before. The door had always been closed. It was not closed now. The little girl was sitting in the center of the room, with the shawl in her lap and her hands pressed on it, and her face doing something terrible and silent that was the precise opposite of what a 4-year-old's face was supposed to do. Hester sat down on the floor beside her, not close enough to crowd, just near. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She had learned that words were sometimes just noise, and that the people who used the most words in the presence of grief were often the people most frightened by it. Nell's breathing had gone ragged. Still no sound. Still fighting it. You don't have to hold it, Hester said. Just that. Not it's okay to cry or let it out or any of the phrases that people say when they want grief to perform itself neatly. Just, you don't have to hold it. The sound that came out of Nell then was the kind that you remember. Small lungs, enormous pain, the shawl crushed against her face. She cried the way children cry when they've been holding it for so long that the release is almost violent in waves, each one larger than the last, her whole small body involved. Hester put her hand on the child's back. She didn't pull her close. She just kept her hand there, steady, the way you keep a hand on something you don't want to blow away. She waited, and then, when the first storm of it had passed, and Nell was in the shaking, exhausted aftermath, the little girl said it. I miss Mama. Not I miss Mama and it hurts. Not I miss Mama and I'm angry. Just the pure simple fact of it, said in the voice of someone who has been carrying an enormous weight and has finally, for one moment, set it down. I know, Hester said. I know you do. Does it stop? Nell asked. The directness of it, the way she looked up at Hester with those wrecked, swollen eyes and asked the question that adults avoided their entire lives, knocked something sideways in Hester's chest. She thought about Thomas. She thought about 4 days and tiny fingers. She told the truth. It changes, she said. It gets different. It doesn't eat you the same way. Did someone leave you? Yes, Hester said. More than one someone. Nell considered this. Then she said, were you scared you'd forget them? Hester had to take a breath before she answered that one. All the time, she said, do you? No, she said. You don't forget. You just learn to carry them different. Nell was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned, not falling, not collapsing, just leaning into Hester's side, the shawl still clutched against her chest. Hester put her arm around the little girl and didn't say anything else. That was where Gideon found them when he came in from the pasture. He appeared in the doorway of Clara's room and stopped, and the expression on his face when he saw his daughter leaning against Hester, small and exhausted, and finally, unburdened. That expression was not something Hester allowed herself to look at for very long because it was too naked to observe for any length of time without feeling like an intrusion. He crouched in the doorway. Nell Bird. She looked at him. Her face was still a mess of tears, and she didn't try to hide it. I cried, she said. Yeah, he said, I can see that. Mrs. Bellamy said it's okay. Mrs. Bellamy's right. His voice was steady. Steadiness of it cost him something, but it held. She usually is. He looked at Hester for a moment over the top of Nell's head, and she looked back, and the look between them was not a romantic thing and not a business thing. Most of its windows were dark. It was something more like the acknowledgement between two people who have been through different versions of the same hard thing, and who, in this particular moment, understood each other without needing to say so. Nell said, I'm hungry. Gideon made a sound that was almost a laugh, broken at the edges, but real. Then let's go eat, he said. The next morning, Nell braided Hester's hair. It was not requested. Hester was sitting at the kitchen table, going over what she needed from the list of things Gideon had said she could draw from the supply stores, and Nell came up behind her with a comb she'd produced from somewhere and simply began. Her technique was 4 years old's technique, lumpy and ambitious, but she was thorough about it, and she narrated the entire process as she went, explaining each section as though she were conducting a lesson. Mama let me practice on her, she said. I wasn't very good yet. You're doing fine, Hester said. It's a little crooked. That's all right. Mama used to say crooked was just a different kind of straight. Hester sat still under the child's hands and looked at the list in front of her and did not let her face do anything that would require explanation. The days built on each other. Nell began eating properly, not perfectly, not always enthusiastically, but properly. She started helping Hester with the baking, in the mornings as a matter of course, not as a project or a therapeutic exercise, just as a thing that was part of the shape of her day. She began talking more. About her mother, sometimes carefully at first, and then with the naturalness of someone who has discovered that the person she's talking to will not flinch or deflect or try to move her along. About the ranch. About the barn cats, 2 of which had decided Hester was acceptable, and one of which, a gray tom with one torn ear that Nell called Captain, had appointed himself her personal escort between house and barn. The garden was a project, she suggested herself. Not Hester. Nell looked at the weeded-over patch one afternoon and said, Mama grew things there. And then, after a pause, could we? So they did. It was the wrong season for most things, but there were cool weather greens that would still take if they moved fast. And Nell was an earnest and somewhat overzealous gardener who watered things with the focused determination of someone who had identified a task and intended to do it correctly. Gideon watched all of this from a careful distance that shortened gradually as the weeks passed. He was not a man who talked about what he was feeling. She suspected he wasn't sure. Half the time, what he was feeling, or if he was sure, wasn't confident, it was the sort of thing he was entitled to feel. He thanked her for practical things, the meals, commended current fix without being asked, the inventory she'd done of the supply stores, and the list she'd written out of what was genuinely needed. He was direct and efficient, and occasionally, when he forgot to maintain the particular brand of professional distance he'd established, surprisingly funny in a dry, understated way that she suspected very few people got to see. She was not thinking about any of that, or she was trying not to. She had enough to think about. It was at the end of the 3rd week that Gideon asked her to stay, not permanently. Not he was careful with his words, she noticed, as though he'd planned them not in a way that was improper. He framed it as a business arrangement, which it was. A month's employment as caregiver and housekeeper, a wage he named that was more than fair, and that she had to work to keep her expression neutral about, because it was also more than she'd made in the past 4 months combined. Nell needs the consistency, he said. They were on the porch. It was one of the first evenings she'd stayed late enough to see the light change. Every time you leave, she watches the road until you're gone. Don't. I'm not trying to make that into something it isn't. I'm telling you what I observe. Hester looked at the road, then at the fields, then at her hands in her lap. A month, she said. A month. And then we see. She thought about her rented room above the tannery. She thought about what she was returning to cheat evening. She thought about Nell watching the road. All right, she said. She should have known that Dustmere would have something to say about it. The first she heard was secondhand from old Pete Sully when she stopped by the livery to arrange for her things to be brought out. He told her without quite meeting her eyes that there was talk, and the look on his face told her the talk was not kind. She thanked him and didn't ask for details, because she could construct them herself without any help. A widow, a rancher, a house with no other woman in it. The town's arithmetic was simple and ugly and completely unsurprising. She told herself it didn't matter. She almost believed it. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly the talk would grow legs and how confidently it would walk. By the second week of the arrangement, she was aware that her presence at Ironwillow had become something the women of Dustmere discussed, with the passionate indignation of people who had identified a moral problem and fully intended to resolve it. She heard it when she made a supply run into town. She heard it in the way the storekeeper's wife paused before answering her questions. She felt it the way you feel weather coming, not yet arrived, but already present in the quality of the air. Gideon was in the far south pasture, dealing with a fence line when they came. 3 horses, 3 women. Ruth Garter in front, Ida Plume to her left, Miss Carlin on the right. They rode into the yard with the practiced confidence of people who had decided in advance how this encounter would go. Hester saw them from the kitchen window and had exactly enough time to dry her hands on her apron before she heard the knock, which was more of a single sharp strike than a knock, the kind that is meant to demonstrate authority rather than request entry. She opened the door. Ruth Garter looked at her with an expression that had been carefully arranged into something that resembled concern. "Mrs. Bellamy," she said, "we've come to talk some sense into you." "Have you?" Hester said. "Not a question. We're thinking of you," Ida Plume said, and her voice had the smooth quality of someone who had said this kind of thing many times and knew exactly how to make it sound like kindness. "And of Nell, of course. What kind of example?" "Nell is learning to eat again," Hester said. "She is learning to sleep through the night. She braided my hair this morning and told me about her mother's garden." "What exactly is the example you're concerned about?" Ruth's expression tightened. "You know what people are saying." "I do," Hester said, "and I know who's doing the saying." The silence that followed had an edge to it. "This isn't appropriate," Ruth said. "A woman alone in a man's house. A woman doing a job she was hired to do," Hester said, "for a fair wage, to care for a child who needed care. If that's what Dustmere wants to make into something shameful, then Dustmere can answer for its own imagination." "You're going to ruin yourself," Miss Carlin said. It was the first thing she'd said, and she said it with a flat certainty that was almost worse than Ruth's performance of concern. "I was already ruined by Dustmere's standards," Hester said. "I was a widow who sold pies nobody bought. I'm not sure the downgrade is significant." She heard the porch door behind her, small feet, then Nell's hand slipping into hers, not reaching for comfort, just present. Standing beside her, Ruth looked at the child. Something complicated crossed her face. Nell looked at the 3 women on horseback with the clear-eyed assessment of a 4-year-old who had spent 7 months being very quiet and very observant. Then she said in her small, rough voice, "She made me eat again. She made me want to wake up again." The yard was very quiet. Ruth Garter opened her mouth, closed it. The sound of hoofbeats on the far track resolved into Gideon coming around the side of the barn, having cut across from the south pasture faster than he should have been able to. Hester suspected he'd seen the horses from a distance and come in at something close to a run. He took in the scene with one look. He looked at Ruth. He looked at Ida. He looked at Miss Carlin. Then he looked at Nell, standing in the doorway with her hand in Hester's. When he spoke, his voice was level in the way that very calm people are level when they are not in fact calm. "I'm going to ask you to leave my property," he said. "I'm going to ask it once, politely, because my daughter is watching. After that, I'm going to ask it a different way." Ruth's chin went up. "We're only trying to—" "I know what you're trying to do," Gideon said. "You've been doing it your whole lives. You find someone who doesn't fit your picture, and you apply pressure until they do or until they leave." He glanced at Hester, briefly. "Mrs. Bellamy stays. Nell needs her. And what Nell needs is the only thing that matters on this property. Now get off it." It wasn't a long speech. It wasn't eloquent. It was just a man with a particular quality of stillness telling 3 women that the line had been drawn, and they were on the wrong side of it. They left. Hester watched them go, Nell's hand was still in hers. Behind them, she heard Gideon come up the porch steps and stop. "You all right?" he asked, addressed to both of them, or neither of them in particular. "Yes," Hester said. Nell said, "Can we make cookies?" Gideon made that sound again, the almost law, broken at the edges. "Real?" "Yeah." "Nell Bird," he said, "go ahead and make cookies." Later, when Nell was upstairs and the kitchen was cleaned, and the evening had darkened, cold outside the windows, Hester sat at the table with the cup of tea she'd made from the last of the leaves she'd brought from her room, and she felt the shape of the day pressing down on her. She had won something today. She was aware of that. But winning in Dustmere had a way of costing things she hadn't planned to spend. The women would go back to town. They would talk. The talk would grow, the way talk always did, feeding on its own energy. And Nell would, eventually, hear some version of it. Children always did. She sat with that knowledge and turned it over in her hands the way she turned dough, looking for the place where it was weakest, where it would tear. She didn't find an answer that night, but she stayed in the kitchen for a long time after the tea was gone, listening to the sounds of the house around her, the creak of the floorboards as the temperature dropped, the wind outside, the distant settling sounds of a structure that had stood through many winters and intended to stand through more. Ironwillow made sounds that her room above the tannery never made. It sounded like a house that had been a home and was in the slow, uncertain, difficult process of becoming one again. She was not sure what her place in that process was. Not permanently. Not yet. But she was here, and Nell was eating, and the garden was planted, and the curtain she'd mended had stayed mended. That was enough for tonight. She turned out the lamp and went to her room and lay in the dark listening to the wind, and she did not dream of January. For the first time in longer than she could easily recall, she did not dream of January at all. The week after Ruth Garter and her company rode away from Ironwillow was, on the surface, a quiet one. Nell ate breakfast every morning. She tended her garden with the focused seriousness of someone who had been given responsibility and intended to honor it. Captain the Gray Tom with the torn ear had by this point fully claimed Hester as his personal property and could be found each morning sitting outside her bedroom door, waiting with the patience of something that had decided the arrangement was permanent. Gideon came in for meals, said what needed to be said, and went back to the work that ranches required in the shortening days of autumn. The bread rose. The curtains hung straight. From the outside, Ironwillow looked like a household that had found its footing. But Hester had lived long enough inside quiet weeks to know that quiet was not always the same as peace. Sometimes it was just the particular stillness of something gathering itself before it moved. She felt it in small ways. The way Gideon looked at her sometimes, when he thought she wasn't paying attention, not improperly, not with anything she could name as a problem, but with the focused consideration of a man working something out in his own head that he hadn't arrived at an answer for yet. She felt it in herself, too, in the way she'd begun to think of the kitchen at Ironwillow, as the kitchen rather than his kitchen, the way she'd started noticing which floorboards creaked and adjusting her step accordingly, without meaning to, the way she knew which lamp burned cleaner, and always reached for that one first. Small accommodations that people make to places they intend to stay in. She had not intended to stay. She had agreed to a month. The month was almost up. She had not brought it up with Gideon, and he had not brought it up with her, and they had both, she suspected, been not bringing it up in the same direction for several days. The day it cracked open started ordinarily enough. She was at the market in Dustmere, a supply run. Nothing more the kind she made every 10 days or so to restock what the ranch kitchen needed. She had her list and her basket, and she moved through the square with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned to conduct business in an environment that is not entirely friendly and has gotten good at it. She knew which vendors would serve her without comment and which would find small reasons to make her wait. She knew to get the flour first, because if she got the coffee first, she'd spend the whole trip smelling it. She was at the dry goods counter, going over her list with the methodical attention she gave everything when she heard her name. Not her whole name. Just that widow in a voice pitched to carry exactly far enough to reach her without being technically directed at her. She had heard that voice before. It belonged to a woman named Vera Halstead, whose husband owned the feed store and who had, in Hester's private assessment, organized her entire social life around the management of other people's reputations. That widow from the market, Vera said to whomever was beside her. Living out at the Rusk place now. A month, near enough. Hester kept her eyes on her list. I heard she's got her things moved in proper, the other voice said. Hester didn't recognize it. Not just coming for the days. Oh, it's more than that, Vera said, with the tone of someone who has been waiting to share something. Sarah Plume told me that Ida told her that she's been seen in the evenings on that porch like she owns it, sitting out there with him, after dark. Well, a pause loaded and deliberate. The child's the one I feel for. Growing up watching that, poor thing already lost her mother. Now she's got well. You know what she's got? Hester set down her list. She turned around. She had not planned to turn around. The dark. It was the kind of decision that bypassed the thinking part of the brain entirely, the part that knew better and went straight to somewhere older and less patient. Vera Halstead looked at her with an expression that flickered briefly between alarm and a very particular kind of pleasure, the pleasure of someone who has said something they calculated would land, and it has landed. You want to say that to me directly, Hester said, not loudly. That was the thing about being quiet for a long time when you finally used your voice it carried without needing volume. Or is it just for the people behind you? I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Vera said, pulling herself up. Yes, you do, Hester said. You know exactly what you mean. What you mean is that a woman like me doesn't deserve the situation I'm in. What you mean is that I must have gotten it by something other than hard work, and because I had the sense to see what nobody else could see. And what you mean under all of that is that it bothers you that I'm there, and you can't figure out why Gideon Rusk can't see what you see. Vera's mouth thinned. I'm thinking of the child. No, Hester said, you're not. She picked up her list. I am. She paid for her goods and walked out, and she did not let herself feel the impact of the exchange until she was in the wagon and out of town, at which point she allowed herself to sit with the discomfort of it for precisely as long as it took to get to the top of the first rise, and then she put it away. But it stayed with her, not the anger. The anger burned itself out cleanly. What stayed was the seed of something she had been pushing aside for weeks, the question she had refused to examine fully, because examining it required being honest about things she wasn't sure she was ready to be honest about. What happened when the month ended? She thought about it that night, alone in her room at Ironwillow while the wind moved outside and Captain sat on the end of her bed with his front paws folded under his chest like a small gray loaf. She thought about it with the lights out, in the kind of dark that is only possible far from town, total and uninterrupted. If she stayed, the talk would continue. It might worsen. And eventually, this was the part she made herself face directly, like pressing on a bruise to find its edges. Eventually, Nell would hear it. Children always heard things. They moved through adult spaces like water through cracks, finding every gap, taking in everything adults assumed they couldn't understand. Nell was not an ordinary 4-year-old in terms of what she had already absorbed. She was a child who had survived something enormous and who was, as a result, more attentive to the emotional temperature of rooms than any child should have to be. When she heard it when someone at the market said something, or a child at some future church gathering repeated what their mother had said, what would she believe? That Hester had done something wrong? That loving Hester was something to be ashamed of. That the warmth she'd found in that kitchen, the braiding and the apple cake and the garden and Captain waiting by the door, that all of it was built on something improper. Hester lay in the dark and pressed her hands flat on the blanket over her chest and thought about that. She thought about a little girl who had already learned, at 4 years old, that love was something that went away, that the people who mattered didn't stay. She thought about the specific lesson that Dustmere would teach if Hester's Tet stayed, and the talk kept building, not the lesson anyone intended to teach, but the one that would land anyway, that being loved by Hester Bellamy was something that came with shame attached. She could not let that be the thing Nell learned. She made the decision before she fully understood that she was making it. The way certain decisions happen not as a choice so much as a recognition that the choice had already been made somewhere deeper than conscious thought and was only now surfacing. She would leave. She would leave before Nell got up, before it could be a conversation, before Nell could argue or hold on or look at her with those clear dark eyes and ask her why. She would write a note for Gideon that was professional and clean, and that made it clear the decision was her own. She would go back to her room above the tannery and her market table, and she would be gone from Ironwillow before it could get worse. She told herself it was for Nell. She believed it. Started packing at 4 in the morning. She packed quietly and methodically, the way she did everything, taking only what was hers and leaving what wasn't, and folding things back into her bag with the careful movements of someone trying not to disturb the air in the room. She had a small amount of belongings. It had never taken long to pack them. She'd learned that. She wrote the note at the kitchen table by lamplight. She wrote several drafts of it. The first ones were too long, and the length was its own kind of explanation she didn't want to give.
She settled on something short.
She thanked him for the wage and for the arrangement, and she said she believed Nell had reached a place where she would continue to improve. She said it had been her privilege. She folded it and put it on the table where he would find it. She stood in the kitchen for a moment before she left. Captain was at her feet, which he had not been doing when she'd gotten up. He had somehow become aware that something was happening and appeared in the kitchen with the expression of a cat that has detected a disturbance in the order of things and is dissatisfied with it. He wound around her ankles once and then sat directly on her right boot, which was something he did when he disagreed with a person's intentions. She picked him up and held him for a moment. He was warm and solid, and his purr had a rough hitch in it that the other barn cats didn't have an old injury, she suspected, or just the individual machinery of this particular animal. She put him down, and he stayed at the door and watched her go. She drove away from Ironwillow in the dark, and she did not look back after the first bend in the road, because she had found in the past that looking back at things served primarily to extend the duration of pain without altering its outcome. She had done the right thing. She told herself that. She told herself that the rest of the way back to Dustmere, and she was still telling herself in her room above the tannery, unpacking her bag with the same systematic care she'd used to pack it, placing her recipe tin back on the shelf, hanging her good apron on its hook. She had done the right thing for Nell. She was 31 years old, and she had done the right thing for Nell, and now she was back in her room that smelled of the tannery below, and had a window that looked at a wall, and she sat on her narrow bed, and she held her own hands together in her lap, the way she held them when she was trying to keep something contained. And she was absolutely certain she had done the right thing. She was almost completely certain. By the end of that first day, she had reduced her certainty to approximately 50%. She did not examine what that meant. She went back to her market table that Saturday, set up in the dark the way she always had, and arranged her goods with the same precision, and she stood behind them with her hands folded, and her face arranged in its patient neutral expression, and she sold a few things and didn't sell others. And she was exactly where she had been before Gideon Rusk rode into the square with his daughter. She told herself she was fine. Then on the third day after she left, she heard from Pete Sully. He came to her table near the end of the morning in a way that was not his usual way. Pete was a man with a rhythm to how he moved through the world, unhurried, efficient, not given to changed pace. The fact that he was moving faster than his usual told her before he said a word. That little girl at the Rusk place, he said, without preamble, because Pete Sully had never in her experience wasted time on approach. Word is she's not eating again. Hester went still. Started the morning after you left, Pete said. Danny, one of Gideon's hands, was in to pick up a harness this morning. Said she sat at breakfast yesterday and the day before and didn't touch anything. And she's not talking again either. He looked at her directly. He said, the little girl told Gideon some yesterday evening. Said, everyone goes away. He said it plainly. Pete was a plain man. But those 3 words, everyone goes away, hit Hester somewhere in the chest, that she had specifically tried to armor against this exact situation, and the armor did not hold. She stood at her market table, and she thought about what she'd done. She had told herself she was protecting Nell. She had told herself that the town's talk would hurt the child if she stayed. And so she had left in the dark before the child was awake, without warning, without a word, and what Nell had received of that, the lesson that landed, the version that stuck, was not Hester left, because she loves me and wanted to protect me. It was another person left. Everyone leaves. Loving someone is just giving them the chance to leave you. She had meant to protect her from shame. Instead, she had confirmed the worst thing Nell already believed. Closed her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. She had done this. She had told herself a story about sacrifice and selflessness and doing the right thing for the child, and every word of it had been true in the way that partial truths are true, accurate on their surface, built something less honest underneath. The less honest thing was fear. She had been afraid of what Dustmere would say. She had been afraid of what staying would mean and what it would cost and what it would ask of her. She had been afraid of needing something and having it taken the way things had been taken before. So she had taken it herself, first, before anyone else could, and she had dressed it up as protection. Pete Sully was still looking at her. He had the quality of a man who had said his piece and was waiting, not because he expected anything in particular, but because he understood that sometimes people needed a few seconds to land. "Thank you, Pete," she said. He nodded. Then he walked away, back to his own business, because that was how Pete Sully operated. Hester began putting her goods away. A woman across the square watched her covering her table mid-morning and frowned slightly, the expression of someone cataloging unusual behavior for later reference. Hester didn't care about that. She was thinking about what she was going to say. Not to Nell. She already knew what she needed to say to Nell, and she knew it couldn't be planned, couldn't be rehearsed, because the truth had a way of only arriving properly, when you stopped trying to shape it in advance and just let it come. She was thinking about what she was going to Gideon because she had left without warning or real explanation, and she had left a professional, clean little note that said nothing about the actual reason, and she had done it at 4 in the morning, like someone running away rather than someone making a choice. And Gideon Rusk was not a man she could look at directly and offer the clean version. She drove to Ironwillow, and she did not turn back this time. The yard was empty when she arrived. The house was quiet in a way that was different from the previous quiet, heavier, the specific weight of a house that has gone inward again. She tied the horse and went to the front door and knocked. Nothing for a long moment. Then the door opened, and it was Gideon. He looked at her with an expression that had so many things in it that she couldn't pull them apart cleanly. Anger was one of them. She'd expected that. Relief was another, which she hadn't fully expected even though she should have. And underneath both of those, something exhausted and ground down that reminded her of the man she'd first seen riding into the square 3 weeks ago, the man running out of road. He didn't say anything, just stood there. "I know I left badly," she said. "I know the note wasn't honest. I need to tell you the real reason, and I need to see Nell." His jaw moved. "She hasn't eaten in 3 days, Hester." He had never called her by her first name before. They had maintained the formal terms throughout Mrs. Bellamy, Mr. Rusk, and she wasn't sure if he noticed that he'd said it, but she heard it clearly. "I know," she said. "Pete told me. 3 days." He said it again, not for information. For something else. "I found her sitting in Clara's room last night, holding that shawl, and she looked like she did before. Before you. And I didn't." He stopped. Something crossed his face. "I didn't know how to reach her. Can I go up?" He stepped back from the door. She went upstairs. She knew which door it was. She had been in Clara's room once, had sat on the floor for beside a weeping child, and put her hand on a small back and waited out a storm. She pushed it open slowly. Nell was sitting on the floor. Not in the center of the room this time, against the wall, with her knees pulled up and the shawl around her shoulders like a shell. She looked up when the door opened, and what Hester saw in her face when she registered who it was, the confusion, the anger, the desperate and involuntary hope, she was clearly trying to shut back down. That expression was worse than any single thing Hester could remember seeing in a long time. She didn't stand in the doorway. She came in and she sat down on the floor, in the same spot she'd sat before, close but not crowding. Nell watched her, said nothing. "I need to tell you something," Hester said. Nell's chin came up slightly, bracing. "I left because I was scared," Hester said. "Not of you, not of anything you did. I was scared of what the people in town were saying, and I told myself I was leaving to protect you, but that wasn't the whole truth." She paused. "The whole truth is that I'm someone who leaves before things can go wrong. I've done it before. It's something I do when I'm afraid, and it's not a good thing to do, and I did it to you." Nell stared at her. Her expression was difficult to read. She had the face of a child who had gotten very good at controlling what showed too young. I should have told you I was going, Hester said. I should have talked to you and your father like you were people who deserved to know. And instead, I left in the dark before you woke up. And that was wrong. It was wrong, and I'm telling you that because I'm not going to pretend it was anything other than what it was. Nell said nothing for a long moment. Then, you said you wouldn't forget. Hester looked at her. I didn't forget you, not for one day. You left. I know. That's what leaving means. The child's voice had a flatness to it that was heartbreaking in its accuracy, the flatness of someone who has worked out a logical system from available evidence and sees no reason to revise it. It means you go and you don't come back. I came back, Hester said. Nell looked at her hands, at the fringe of the shawl, at a point somewhere between them. Maybe you'll leave again, she said. Quiet, not accusatory, just the honest assessment of a child who has learned to calculate odds. I might make mistakes again, Hester said. I'm going to be honest with you about that, because you're old enough to hear honest things. I make mistakes. I got scared and I made a bad one. But I'm here now, and I'm telling you to your face that leaving the way I did was wrong, and I don't intend to do it again. The silence stretched. Then Nell unfolded slightly, not dramatically, not all at once, just the incremental relaxation of a small body that has been holding itself rigid for 3 days and is considering the possibility of stopping. She didn't speak right away. She reached out slowly and touched the cuff of Hester's sleeve, just the tips of her fingers, the way you touch something to verify it's real. Are you staying? She asked. That depends on your father, Hester said. That's his decision too. Nell looked at her for a moment, considering. Then she got up, still carrying the shawl. She went to the door, opened it, and called down the stairs in a voice that was rough from days of silence. Papa. She wants to stay. The silence from below the stairs lasted long enough that Hester had time to feel every possible version of what might come next, lined up and waiting. Then she heard boots on the stairs. Gideon appeared in the doorway. He looked at his daughter, and then at Hester, still sitting on the floor with her hands in her lap. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He spoke the way he did most things levelly, without theater. You want to tell me why you really left? She told him. She didn't make it shorter than it was. She didn't make herself better in the telling. She said she'd been afraid, and she'd hidden the fear behind something that sounded more acceptable. And she'd left a 4-year-old without a goodbye and a man without a real explanation, and both of those things were wrong. Gideon listened. He leaned in the doorway with his arms crossed. Not defensively, it was just how he stood when he was thinking, and he listened to the whole of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You thought leaving would protect her, he said. I thought that. Yes. And then you thought something else. Pete Sully told me what she said. She paused. Everyone goes away. He looked at the floor briefly. Yeah, a short exhale. She said that to me the night before last. Sitting in the kitchen. No expression. Just said it and got up and went to bed. Hester didn't say anything. I knew the first morning, he said. When I found your note, I knew within about an hour that it was a mistake. Not because of the cooking or the housework or any of that. He looked up. Because she went straight back to where she'd been. Not gradually. Straight back, like you'd been the only thing between her and it. She'll carry that regardless, Hester said. What she lost. I can't take it from her. But I can make sure she knows it won't be compounded every time she attaches herself to something. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. You planning to leave again? Not the way I did, she said. Not without a conversation. He uncrossed his arms, looked at his daughter, who was watching this exchange with the focused attention she gave to anything that affected the structure of her world. Then he looked at Hester. Then come back, he said. Not because Nell needs a cook. Not because I need a housekeeper. He stopped. I need you to understand the difference between those things and what I'm actually saying. She looked at him carefully. His face was not an easy face to read. It was a face that had been working to not show things for a long time. But there were places in it around the eyes, in the way his jaw moved, where the effort was visible. I know what you're saying, she said. Do you? Yes. He nodded. Once. Then come back. She got up from the floor. She straightened her apron. She looked at Nell, who was still in the doorway with the shawl and the fringe between her fingers and the watchful expression of a child who has just heard something important and is deciding how to file it. I need to bring my things, Hester said. I'll be back this afternoon. I'll go with you, Nell said immediately, not as a question. Hester looked at Gideon. He gave a small nod. All right, Hester said. Get your coat. She came back that afternoon with her recipe tin and her good apron and the few things that constituted her belongings in a room above a tannery, and she did not look back at the room when she left it because she had developed, over the years, precise awareness of which things deserved a backward look and which did not. The room did not. Ironwillow did. Nell chattered the entire drive back, which was so different from the drive out that first morning with the cold and the doubt and the near turnarounds that it required a small adjustment to reconcile them as the same road. She talked about Captain, who had apparently been sitting at Hester's bedroom door for 3 days and becoming increasingly critical about the situation. She talked about the garden and which plants had come up and which had done nothing, and she had opinions about the ones that had done nothing that were delivered with the authority of someone who had put in the work and expected results. She talked about her mother once, briefly not with grief, or not primarily with grief. She said that her mother would have liked Hester's bread because her mother had liked things that were straightforward and honest, and not trying to be something fancier than they were. Hester thought that was one of the finest things anyone had ever said about her bread. When they pulled into the Ironwillow yard, Nell climbed down before the wagon had fully stopped, which was something Hester intended to address at a less complicated moment, and ran to the barn, presumably to report the situation to Captain. Gideon came out of the house. He helped her with the bag, which she let him do, and they walked toward the door in a silence that was not uncomfortable. She talked the whole way, Hester said. She talked the whole way here, too, he said. After I told her you were coming back. They went inside. Kitchen was exactly as she'd left it when she'd packed in the dark 3 days ago, except that nothing had been cooked in it, and the surfaces had the particular quality of things that have been left alone, not dirty, just still, unused. She set her tin on the counter. She put on her apron. Behind her, she heard Gideon stop in the doorway. She heard him pick something up from the table, the note she'd left, she realized. She heard him refold it. He didn't say anything. She didn't look around. I'm going to need more flour, she said. What I brought won't last the week. I'll get it, he said. Tomorrow. And the apples in the cellar, the ones by the east wall, those are going to turn if someone doesn't do something with them in the next few days. I know. She started the stove. Behind her, she heard him put the note down on the table and then walk out to the barn, probably to tell the hands something needed doing, which was how men like Gideon handled the moments that required privacy. She stirred the fire. She measured out what flour she had. She listened to the house settle around her, the particular sounds she had already memorized without meaning to, the creak on the left side of the third step, the way the kitchen window rattled slightly in a north wind, the distant sounds of the barn. Captain appeared from somewhere and sat on her right boot. She looked down at him. He looked up at her with the expression of a cat who has been proven right about something and expects acknowledgement. She reached down and scratched the top of his head. Outside, she could hear Nell in the yard, talking to the other barn cats in the specific tone of a child who is narrating events to an audience she considers important. She heard one clear sentence float. Through the window, she came back. I told Papa she would. Hester stood at the counter with her hands in the flour, and she felt, without trying to resist it, the full weight of what she had almost lost by doing the cowardly thing that looked like the noble thing. She felt it and she held it, and then she set it down, the way she had set down other things she couldn't afford to carry forever. She had work to do. The bread wasn't going to make itself, and the apples needed to be dealt with, and Nell needed supper, and the flour she had left was just enough for tonight if she didn't waste any of it. She got to work. The apples got dealt with that same evening. Hester worked through them systematically, while Nell sat on the counter beside the bowl, a position that had been established early in their arrangement, and that Hester had never formally permitted, but had also never formally forbidden, and which had therefore become fixed as one of the unspoken rules of how they operated together in a kitchen. Nell sorted the good ones from the ones that had gone soft, which she took seriously as a responsibility, and she narrated her assessments with the confidence of someone who has been given authority and intends to exercise it properly. This one's still good on one side, she said, holding up an apple with a soft spot the size of a thumb. Cut the bad part off. The rest is fine. Mama used to say that about things. She turned the apple in her hands. That you could cut the bad part off. Smart woman, Hester said. She was. A pause. Not sad. Exactly. More like the weight of a fact you've learned to carry without dropping. She was really smart. Tell me something smart, she said. Nell thought about it seriously. She said that cold hands made better pie crust. Hester looked up from the apples. She was right about that. Why? Warm hands melt the butter too fast. You want the butter to stay cold until it goes in the oven, and then it steams, and that's what makes it flaky. She paused. Your mother knew what she was doing. Nell held the apple for a moment, processing this. Then she went back to sorting with renewed authority, and Hester went back to peeling, and the kitchen held them both, without any particular drama, which was exactly as it should be. She heard Gideon come in from the barn during the second hour. He washed his hands at the basin near the back door and stood for a moment in a way she had learned to recognize, not interrupting, not requiring anything, just being in the same space. He did this sometimes in the evenings, occupying the kitchen the way a person occupies a room they have been absent from for a long time and are not yet sure they fully belong back in. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made earlier and leaned against the far counter. Smells better in here than it has in a while, he said. You were working with what you had, Hester said. Not as a criticism, just as a fact. I was burning things, he said. Let's not dress it up. You kept people fed. He looked at Nell. 7, Nell said. But Mrs. Bellamy said we can still use most of them. We can, Hester confirmed. Soft apples make better sauce anyway. The texture breaks down cleaner. Gideon watched his daughter sort through apples on the counter with the expression of a man who has been given back something he thought was gone, and who is still, weeks later, not fully accustomed to having it. There was gratitude in that expression, which she had seen before. Tonight there was something else alongside it. Something that had been building in small increments she'd been cataloging without meaning to, the way you catalog weather, without specifically deciding to pay attention to the sky. She kept her eyes on the apples. The days that followed her return settled into a rhythm that was different from the first arrangement, not more formal, but more honest. Something had been said, or almost said, and while none of it had been resolved in any final way, it existed now in the open air between them, rather than underneath everything, and that made the ordinary business of the days feel less pressurized. Nell had not retreated again. If anything, she had moved closer, not in a clinging way, but with the specific deliberateness of a child who has decided to stop hedging her bets. She helped in the kitchen every morning without being asked. She told Hester things, detailed wandering, 4-year-old things about the horses and the barn cats and a boy at the church. Gathering her father had taken her to once who had said something she disagreed with, and she still disagreed with it and intended to let it be known. She talked about her mother with increasing ease, not constantly, not dramatically, but the way you mention someone who is part of your history and therefore part of your sentences naturally in the middle of other things without making it a production. Hester listened every time. She didn't redirect. She didn't offer comfort unless it was needed. She just listened and sometimes asked questions and let Clara Rusk exist in the kitchen the way she deserved to, as someone real who had mattered, not as a wound to be managed. Gideon noticed. Of course he noticed. He was a man who paid attention to things, even when he appeared not to be. He said, one evening when Nell had gone to bed and Hester was at the table going over the supply list for the week, she talked about Clara today, to one of the hands, Danny. Just brought her up in the middle of something else. He paused. She hasn't done that before. Not to anyone outside the house. That's good, Hester said. Yeah. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I know it is. It just stopped. Started differently. When she first stopped talking, after Clara died, the doctor said to not push it. Don't bring up the mother. Don't make her talk about it. Let her come to it in her own time. And I did that. I did everything he said. He set the cup down. I think I made it worse. I think she read my not talking about it as confirmation that it was something we couldn't survive saying out loud. Hester looked up from the list. You were trying to protect her. I was, he said. I was also trying to protect myself. A beat. I find it hard to talk about Clara. I won't pretend that was all about Nell. She regarded him for a moment. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the table or somewhere past it. And the honesty in what he'd said had the texture of something that had been worked toward for a long time and had only now made it out. You talk about her, she said. When Nell brings her up, you don't flinch. That took practice, he said. Watching you not flinch. A pause. You don't. Even when she says something that he stopped. The other day, she said Clara used to hum while she cooked. You hum while you cook. Hester was quiet. She wasn't making a comparison, he said. She was just noticing. But I thought you should know she noticed. She didn't know what to do with that, entirely. So she did what she usually did with things she didn't know what to do with. She filed it, and went back to the supply list and let the conversation find its own ending, which it did, the way their conversations tended to, not dramatically, just a natural settling into quiet that didn't require management. It was the following Tuesday that Dustmere made its next move. She had been expecting something. The Ruth Garter incident had been too visible and too public to simply dissipate, and the wagon tracks of gossip never dried up cleanly in a town that size. What she hadn't anticipated was the specific form it would take, or who would deliver it. The man who came to Ironwillow that Tuesday afternoon was named Harlan Briggs, and he was the closest thing Dustmere had to a civic authority, not an elected official exactly, but the kind of man who had been in a place long enough and owned enough of it that he occupied a position of informal power that most people treated as formal. He was in his 60s, lean, with the deliberate manner of someone who has never in his adult life been told he was wrong about anything significant. He arrived alone, which she noted. Ruth and her company had come in force. Harlan coming alone meant he considered this a conversation rather than a confrontation, which was either better or worse, depending on how you looked at it. Gideon was in the yard when he rode up, and Hester watched from the kitchen window as they exchanged words. Gideon's posture shifting into something she recognized as controlled disagreement, Harlan's hands doing the deliberate, measured gestures of a man making a case he believes is reasonable. After a few minutes, Gideon came to the kitchen door. Harlan Briggs wants a word with you, he said. His tone was flat in the particular way that meant he had already decided something and was holding it in place while being fair. I know what he wants, she said. You don't have to. I know that too. She dried her hands. I'll talk to him. She went outside. Harlan Briggs looked at her the way men of his type looked at women they had underestimated, and were now reassessing not entirely pleasantly, but with more attention than before. Mrs. Bellamy, he said. Mr. Briggs, I'm going to be plain with you, he said. I don't think you're a bad woman. I appreciate that, she said. What I think is that you're a woman in a complicated situation that has gotten more complicated than is good for anyone involved. Talk in town isn't going to stop. You've been here close to 2 months now, and the arrangement is— He chose his word carefully. Irregular. What would make it regular, she asked. He blinked. He'd expected something else, defensiveness, probably, or deflection. Her directness required a half-second recalibration. Proper arrangement, he said. Something formal. Or your departure. A proper arrangement meaning marriage, she said. That would settle it, he said. And whose idea is it that I should be the one to make it regular or leave? She asked. You came to me, not to Mr. Rusk. Harlan Briggs had the grace to show a flicker of something uncomfortable. He's a man with a child and a ranch, and I'm a widow with a baking tin, she said. So I'm the movable piece. She kept her voice even. I understand the logic. I understand the town's position. I want to make sure you understand that the arrangement here is employment, that I was hired for a fair wage to care for a grieving child, that I have done that job, and that the nature of what the town wants to make of it is the town's business and not mine. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. He was not a stupid man. She could see him processing the conversation and arriving at the conclusion that it was not going the direction he'd planned. The child is why I came, he said, and his voice had shifted slightly less formal, more honest. Not for the gossip. The girl. There's a way this could go that hurts her. I know, Hester said. I think about that every day. Then you understand that the thing most likely to hurt her is not where I sleep or what the town thinks about it, she said. The thing most likely to hurt her is any version of this that teaches her she can be used to pressure people into decisions. I won't be pressured, and I won't let her be used that way either. Silence. Then Harlan Briggs did something she hadn't expected. He exhaled, not dramatically. Just a man letting something go. You're not easy, he said. No, she agreed. Neither is Gideon, in case you hadn't noticed. I noticed. He looked at her for another moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat, not effusively, not the performance of courtesy, just the reflex of a man with old manners. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Bellamy. I rode out here expecting to make a point, and I'm not sure I've made it. You made it, she said. I just don't think the solution you came with is the right one. What's the right one? That's not my question to answer alone, she said, and not yours either. He rode away without resolution, which Hester suspected he was not accustomed to. She stood in the yard until he'd gone around the first bend, and then she turned and found Gideon standing by the porch steps. He had heard some of it. She could tell, by the quality of his expression, not amused, not alarmed, somewhere between the two. He told you to leave or get married, Gideon said, essentially. What did you tell him? That it wasn't a decision I could make alone. Gideon was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light had gotten long and orange, the kind that made the fields look warmer than they were. He looked out at the property, the near pasture, the repaired fence line, the barn with its new boards on the east wall where he'd replaced the rotted ones 2 weeks ago. Hester, he said. She had noticed that he'd started using her first name occasionally. Not consistently, there were still days of Mrs. Bellamy, mostly when there were other people around or when he was being careful about something. But sometimes, like now, it came out like it had always been there. She looked at him. I'm not a man who he started again. I don't talk about things the way some men do. I'm aware that's a limitation. Clara used to say I could conduct an entire emotional crisis by just fixing things around the property. She wasn't wrong, Hester said. The corner of his mouth moved. No, she wasn't. He looked at the fence. I've replaced 14 fence posts since you came back. She waited. That's not what I'm trying to say, he said. What I'm trying to say is that what I feel. He stopped again. Stopping was not evasion, she understood. It was the genuine difficulty of a man who lives inside his actions and is now trying to translate them into words, which is a different language entirely. What I feel is not something I arrived at because of what Harlan Briggs said, or because of what Ruth Garter thinks, or because of what would make things regular. I want to be very clear about that. I know, she said. Do you? She looked at him. He was looking at her now, directly, which was something he did rarely, and which, when he did it, had a weight to it, not aggressive, just present, fully present in a way that most people weren't. You're not necessary to this house, he said. I want you to understand what I mean by that. I kept this house before. I kept it badly, and I kept it empty, and I would have kept keeping it, because that's what you do. You keep going. You're not necessary. He paused. You're wanted. That's different. I need you to know the difference matters to me. The words settled. She had heard many things said to her in her 31 years. Some of them kind. Some of them not. Some of them said with a great performance of feeling that turned out to be mostly to performing. She had learned to assess them the way she assessed dough, not by what they appeared to be on the surface, but by what they were made of underneath. You're not necessary. You're wanted. She stood in the afternoon light with her hands on sides, and she felt, with the clarity of something that has finally come into focus after a long time of being blurred, that this was a man who said exactly what he meant, and had just said something that cost him. I'm not easy either, she said, in case that wasn't clear. It's been clear from the beginning, he said. I don't mind it. I have bad months. I had a husband and a child, and I lost them both. And some days that's far away, and some days it isn't. She said it because it needed to be said, because whatever came next needed to be built on what was actually true, not on a cleaned-up version. I leave when I'm frightened, which you know. I have opinions about things that I'll state whether I've been asked or not. I know all of that, he said. I'm telling you so you can't say later that you weren't informed. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face did the thing it rarely did. It opened, just slightly. Just enough to see what was behind the weathered, capable, managed exterior. Will you stay, he asked. Not for a month, not for a wage. Will you stay? She was quiet. She thought about her room above the tannery. She thought about Thomas. She thought about 4 days and tiny fingers and the frozen ground in January. She thought about what it had cost her to come back after she'd left, and what it would cost her to stay, whether the costs were the kind she was capable of paying. She thought about Nell on the stairs at 5 in the morning, with the shawl around her shoulders, asking if Hester had ever been scared at nighttime. Yes, she said, I'll stay. Gideon nodded. He didn't reach for her. He wasn't that kind of man in that kind of moment. He just nodded, once as though something important had been confirmed, and he intended to honor it. I'm going to ask you to marry me, he said, not today. When it's not connected to Harlan Briggs riding out here. I don't want you to think that's what caused it. I know what caused it, she said, and I know what didn't. Good, he said. He looked out at the fence line again. There's a post on the north side that needs replacing. Go fix it, she said. He went. She stood in the yard for another moment after he'd gone, in the long orange light, and she felt the shape of what had just happened sitting around her, like the after effect of something seismic, not dramatic. Nothing had fallen, but the ground had shifted in a way that was permanent. She went back inside. Nell was at the kitchen table. She came in, drawing something on a piece of brown paper with the stub of a pencil she'd found somewhere. She looked up when Hester entered. She had the expression of a child who had been listening to sounds from outside and not quite hearing the words and was now conducting an assessment. Is Mr. Briggs coming back? She asked. Probably not, Hester said. What did he want? Hester considered how to answer. Nell was 4 years old, and she was also, in certain ways, the most perceptive person at Ironwillow, and she deserved an honest answer at a level she could use. He had concerns about our arrangement, she said. I told him the arrangement was working fine. Nell considered this. Ruth Garter had concerns too, she did. Lots of people have concerns about us, Nell said, with the tone of someone who is observing a pattern and thinks the pattern is worth noting. Yes, Hester said. Why? Hester sat down at the table across from her. Because people in towns sometimes need things to look a particular way before they feel comfortable, and we don't look the way they expected. Nell thought about this. Is that bad? No, Hester said, but it takes some getting used to, for them. Nell looked at her drawing. It appeared to be a house with a very large cat in front of it, which Hester suspected was meant to be Captain, though his proportions were ambitious. I don't mind, Nell said. What we look like, neither do I, Hester said. Nell went back to her drawing. Hester got up and started on supper, and the kitchen held them the way it had been holding them for weeks easily, without effort, like a space that had been built for exactly this. The question Gideon had said he was going to ask came on a Thursday evening 4 days later. She had not been anticipating a particular moment. She was not a woman who spent her time anticipating particular moments, having found that life rarely cooperated with that kind of planning. She was on the porch because the evening had gone warm, and she'd wanted the air after a day of close work indoors, and she was sitting on the top step with her hands around a cup of tea and Captain across her feet like a weighted door blanket, when she heard the door behind her. Gideon came and sat on the step beside her, not the other end of the step, beside her, which left about 6 inches between them, which was closer than they usually were when not in motion. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the property in the early dark. Sky out here was doing what it did on clear October evenings, going deep blue at the top and holding the orange at the horizon, the stars appearing in the order they always appeared. I replaced the last fence post, he said. I know, she said. I saw you come in. I've been replacing things for weeks, he said. I noticed. He was quiet again. Then, I told you I was going to ask you something. When it wasn't connected to outside pressure, you did. Is now a good time? She looked at the fields. Probably not going to be a better one, she said. He didn't turn toward her, and he didn't reach for her hand, and he didn't make anything more theatrical of it than the asking, which was exactly right, because anything more theatrical would have been a performance, and they were not performers. He said, looking at the property he'd spent years building and almost lost from the inside out, "Will you marry me, Hester?" She looked at him. He was looking out at the land. She could see his profile in the last of the evening light, the jaw, the working muscle of it, the eyes that were steady, even when the rest of him was not entirely steady. He was a man who had loved someone and lost her and had kept the fences standing while the inside of his house went dark. And he was asking her something that cost him considerably, and he was not making her watch him pay it. She thought about what it meant. Not just the word, not the formal arrangement, but what it meant to agree to be known by someone, to be failed by someone, and to fail them in return, which was inevitable. to show them the parts of yourself that January had made and that Thomas had not seen the end of, and to let them decide that they were still asking. He was still asking. She had been running the arithmetic of this for weeks in the back of her mind, without letting herself call it what it was. And arithmetic was not the right instrument for the question being asked. Arithmetic was for coin stacks and supply lists. This was something else. Yes, she said. He exhaled, one breath slow and deep, like a man who has been holding something in for a considerable time and has finally been told he can set it down. He turned to look at her then, and the expression on his face was not the performance of joy. It was something quieter and more lasting. The expression of a person for whom something specific and important has just become real. He reached over and put his hand over hers, where it rested on her knee. Just his hand over hers. He didn't say anything. They sat that way for a while on the porch steps while the dark came in from the east, and Captain resettled himself across both their feet with the air of a cat who has concluded that the situation has been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Nell's voice came from inside. Through the window she had been put to bed an hour ago and had clearly been neither fully asleep nor awake, which was her usual condition at this hour. So, is someone on the porch? It's just us, Hester said toward the window. Okay, said Nell, a pause. Mrs. Bellamy? Yes. Are you staying for dinner tomorrow? Gideon made the sound that was not quite a laugh. She felt it more than heard it through his hand over hers. Yes, Hester called back. I'm staying for dinner tomorrow. Okay. A settling of small bed springs. Good night. Good night, Nell. She heard the child roll over and go still. In the way children go, they have received the piece of information they needed and can now sleep. Hester looked at the fields, at the dark coming in, at the first real cluster of stars appearing overhead. She's going to want to be involved in the wedding, Gideon said. I know. She's going to have opinions. She has opinions about apple slices, Hester said. I'm prepared. He turned his hand slightly so that it was less covering and more holding. She let him. It was a small thing, and it was also not small at all. I want you to know, he said quietly, that I know what you gave up. Coming here staying. He paused. I know it wasn't only Nell. I know there was more that you carried before any of this. She thought about Thomas. She thought about January. She thought about what it meant to have been seen accurately by someone, the strange exposed discomfort of it and the strange relief of it in equal measure. I know what you gave up too, she said, after Clara. He nodded. He didn't say anything else about it, and she didn't either. And that was its own form of understanding, knowing where the weight was and acknowledging it without requiring it to be performed. Stars were proper stars by now. The wind had gone easy. Captain had started purring in the low, rough way he had, the one with the hitch in it. She had a wedding to plan that she had absolutely no idea how to plan in a town that had spent 2 months developing opinions about her. She had a 4-year-old with strong views about most things who was going to be involved in every decision. She had a man beside her who expressed his feelings primarily through fence post replacement and who, she suspected, was going to find the practical details of a wedding. In Dustmere, Wyoming, an exercise in gritted patience. She was not sure how any of it would go. She was, for the first time in longer than she could easily name, not particularly afraid of not being sure. Porch held them. The night came in around the edges. Ironwillow made its sounds, the barn settling, a horse moving in the near pasture, the distant, ordinary music of a working ranch coming to the end of its day. She had work tomorrow. Bread to start before sunrise, and the supply list still needed finishing. And Nell's garden had something coming up in the 3rd row that they hadn't planted and needed to figure out what it was. That was tomorrow. Tonight she sat on the porch in the dark with Gideon's hand over hers, and the stars doing what they did, and Captain purring his rough, hitching purr, and she did not measure anything. She just sat. Nell had opinions about the wedding dress. This was not a surprise. Nell had opinions about most things, the correct thickness of apple slices, the proper distance between garden rows, which barn cat was most trustworthy, and which was operating under a personal agenda, and a wedding dress was not going to be the exception. She communicated these opinions the morning after Gideon and Hester's porch conversation. The focused energy with the focused energy of someone who has been thinking about something overnight and arrived at conclusions. Not black, she said, at breakfast. as though the conversation had already been going for several minutes inside her head, and she was simply allowing the rest of them to catch up. Gideon looked at his coffee. Hester looked at Nell. "I wasn't planning on black," Hester said. "Some widows wear black," Nell said. She had clearly been processing her knowledge of widows. "But you shouldn't. You should wear something that looks like you're happy." "What color is that?" Hester asked. Nell thought about it seriously, in the way she thought about things that mattered. "Blue," she said. "Or maybe the color of the bread when it comes out right. That kind of gold." Gideon made a sound behind his coffee cup. "I'll keep that in mind," Hester said. The wedding planning, as she had anticipated, was not simple. The complications were not the romantic kind, not disagreements about sentiment or symbol, or any of the territory that made weddings difficult in the way stories usually made them difficult. The complications were practical and social, and they were all, in one way or another, connected to the fact that Dustmere had spent 2 months building a position on Hester Bellamy, and was now going to be required to watch that position become formally untenable. She did not particularly want a large wedding. She had been married before quietly, in a county office in Ohio, with Thomas and 2 witnesses, and that had suited her then, and the memory of it suited her still. What she wanted now was something honest and without theater, something that said what needed to be said without performing it. What she got was slightly more complicated than that, because Dustmere was a town, and towns had their own gravity. Gideon handled the formal part. He was efficient about it. In the way he was efficient about most things, he identified what needed to be done. He did it. He reported back. He spoke to the appropriate people. He filed what needed filing. He arranged what needed arranging. He came home from town one afternoon and told her it was set for 3 weeks from Saturday, and that he'd spoken to Harlan Briggs, who had been, he said, less resistant than expected. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "I told him what was happening, and I told him I wasn't asking his opinion. I was informing him as a courtesy." A pause. He said it was good news for the child, which I think was the closest he could get to saying he'd been wrong. "That's a reasonable distance for him," she said. "I thought so." Ruth Garter was a different calculation. Ruth did not have Harlan's capacity for quiet revision. Ruth had invested publicly in a position, and public positions, once invested in, required either doubling down or a retreat that felt like surrender, and Ruth Garter was not a woman who retreated. Hester expected some form of final maneuver, the way you expect the last hard frost of the season, not because you can know exactly when it will come, but because you understand the nature of the weather. It came on a Wednesday, 10 days before the wedding, when Hester was in Dustmere for supplies. She was at the dry goods counter, and Ruth was behind her. She heard her voice first, the particular carrying quality of it, and Ruth said to whoever was beside her, "I hear the Rusk man is going through with it, marrying her." A pause. Well, Ruth's voice arranged into something that sounded like resigned sorrow. He's a lonely man, and she knew exactly how to use that. "I feel for the child most of all." Hester set down the tin of baking powder she'd been holding. She turned around. She had turned around once before in this same square, under similar circumstances. That time she'd been angry and direct, and it had been satisfying in the moment and complicated afterward. This time she felt something different, not anger exactly, or not primarily anger. Something more tired and more clear-eyed. Ruth was talking to Vera Halstead, which meant the audience was the 2 of them and the general vicinity of anyone within earshot, which in a dry goods store on a Wednesday morning was 6 or 7 people. Hester waited until Ruth looked at her. Ruth did, eventually, with the expression of someone who has said a thing into what they thought was a private space and has discovered it was not. "I want to ask you something," Hester said. Not loudly. The room had already gone quiet in that particular way. "You said you feel for the child. I'd like to know what you've done for her." Specifically, Ruth's chin came up. "I've said a great deal on behalf of her welfare." "That's not what I asked," Hester said. "I asked what you've done. Have you brought her food? Have you sat with her? Have you listened to her talk about her mother?" She paused. "She was starving in front of this town for 7 months, and the thing you found to do for her was to knock a pie off my table." The room was very quiet now. Ruth's face had done several things in rapid succession and had landed on something that looked like outrage, but had an uncertain quality underneath it. The expression of someone who has built an argument and is discovering it has a structural problem. I have a community's moral. The child is eating, Hester said. She is sleeping. She is growing things in a garden, and she has named every barn cat at Ironwillow, and she braids hair, and she has opinions about apple slices. She is not a welfare project. She is a little girl who needed someone to sit down beside her and wait. She picked up the baking powder. If the community's moral welfare is what you're interested in, that is available to you. It just requires sitting down, which is harder than talking. She paid for her goods, and she left. She did not feel triumphant walking out. She felt wrung out and slightly shaky in the hands, the way she always felt after she said a true thing in a public place, because true things in public cost more than she usually had to spend. She loaded her wagon, and she sat for a moment before picking up the reins, just to let her hands settle. She didn't know if it had done anything. She didn't know if Ruth Garter was capable of revision or if the words had bounced off something hard and permanent. She didn't know what the town would make of it. She had never been good at predicting what Dustmere would make of things. What she knew was that she had said what was true, and that Nell would never hear that she had stayed quiet when she could have spoken. She drove back to Ironwillow, and she put the supplies away. And she did not mention the encounter to Gideon, not because she was hiding it, but because it was hers, and she did not need it witnessed to make it real. She told him about the price of flour, which had gone up, and about a new variety of dried beans the storekeeper had gotten in that she thought were worth trying. He listened with the attention he gave practical information, and they discussed the beans with the seriousness beans deserved, and then she started supper, and the day moved forward. The wedding was on a Saturday, which meant the market was on. She had considered this and decided it was appropriate. The market was where everything had started, after all. The windows were dark. It was where a pie had been knocked to the ground, and where a man had ridden in with a child who would not eat, and where a star-shaped butter cookie had changed the direction of 3 lives. Starting the marriage on that same day felt honest. They were married in the morning, before the market fully opened, in front of the same community that had spent 2 months developing opinions about Hester Bellamy. The ceremony was brief and without theater, conducted by a traveling justice of the peace who had the efficient, unsentimental quality of someone who has married many people and understood that the words mattered and the duration did not. Nell stood between them and held Hester's hand through the whole of it with a focused grip that suggested she had been assigned this responsibility and intended to execute it properly. She was wearing the blue dress. Hester had helped her alter from one that had been too large, and her hair was braided. Hester had done the braiding that morning more competently than any braid Nell had ever attempted on Hester, and she was gravely attentive in the way of children who understand that what is happening is important even if they do not understand every particular of why. When it was done, and Gideon had signed what needed signing and Hester had signed beside him, he looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his something large the closed, steady face with the open thing underneath it, and she looked back with what she suspected was her own versions of the same. He took her hand, not dramatically, just reached over and took it the way a person reaches for something they have decided is theirs to hold. The whispers started almost immediately as they turned to walk away. She heard them. She was not deaf, and they were not quiet, and she felt Gideon's hand tighten slightly around hers. Not out of distress, but out of the specific tension of a man deciding something. Stopped walking. She felt the decision move through him before he acted on it, a particular kindness that preceded intention. He turned around, not all the way, just enough. "I want to say something," he said, not loudly. But Gideon Rusk had the kind of voice that carried without effort, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard outdoors over wind and distance. The square had the quality of a place that has gone attentive. "This woman saved my daughter's life," he said, not as a figure of speech. My daughter stopped eating and stopped talking and stopped being willing to live in the world, and this woman sat down beside her and waited until she was ready to come back. She did it when nobody else thought to try. She did it fit for a child she had no obligation to." He paused. "She is my wife. She is Nell's mother. Anyone who has something to say about that can say it to me." Silence. Real silence. The kind that has weight. Nobody said anything. Nell, standing between them, looked up at Gideon with an expression that was half pride and half the assessment of a child who has just witnessed something she intends to remember. Then she looked at Hester. Then she squeezed the hand she was still holding and said, in her serious voice, "Can we go get breakfast now?" The sound that moved through the small gathered crowd was not quite laughter. It was something softer than that. Something that acknowledged, without anyone having to admit it explicitly, that a 4-year-old had just put a thing in proportion. "Yes," Hester said, "we can go get breakfast." Ruth Garter was at the edge of the crowd. Hester saw her as they walked past. She was not sneering. She was not performing satisfaction or righteous vindication. She was just standing there with an expression that was difficult to read, and that Hester did not spend much time trying to read, because some things did not require resolution, and some people's internal revisions were their own business. She had said her true thing. That was enough. The breakfast was at Ironwillow, back at the ranch, because neither of them had wanted a gathering at a restaurant or a hall. Danny and 2 of the other hands came, and Pete Sully came, which surprised her pleasantly, and Harlan Briggs appeared briefly with his wife, who shook Hester's hand with the firm grip of a woman who makes up her own mind, and seemed to have done so in Hester's favor, which she appreciated. Nell managed the serving of the baked goods with the authority of someone who had been preparing for exactly this responsibility and found it adequate to her capacities. She narrated the origin of each item, Mrs. Bellamy made these. They have too much butter, but that's the right amount, and accepted compliments on the apple cake with the graciousness of someone who understood the distinction between accepting credit and deflecting it falsely. Pete Sully ate 2 pieces of the apple cake and said, to no one in particular, "Best thing to happen in Znan County in a long time." Nobody argued with him. What happened to Ironwillow after that was not a transformation in the dramatic sense. Things did not suddenly become easy or simple or without friction. The ranch had genuine problems that a wedding did not solve. There was a section of the north pasture that was overworked and needed to rest, and the price of cattle had done something unhelpful in the fall markets. And one of the hands quit in December for reasons that were complicated and required replacing, which took longer than it should have. Real life did not pause for happiness. But the shape of the place changed, and the change was real. And Hester noticed it the way she noticed the things she'd come to notice at Ironwillow, through accumulated small evidence rather than single dramatic signals. Kitchen was different, not just because it was used properly, now it had been used properly for months. But there was a quality to it in the mornings that had not been there when she'd first arrived and stood in the doorway, seeing a room that had been a center and had gone cold. The quality was something she could only describe as inhabited, not by any one person. By all of them together, in the overlapping, uncoordinated, sometimes inconvenient way that people inhabit spaces, when they are genuinely living in them rather than moving through them. Nell spilled things. She spilled them with the frequencies that Hester suspected was at least partially a function of enthusiasm exceeding coordination, and the spills were absorbed into the life of the kitchen. The way spills are absorbed in places where people actually live, cleaned up, noted, occasionally commented on, and forgotten. The floor had permanent evidence of Nell's presence on it in the way that floors do in houses with children, and Hester felt, every time she noticed it, something she could not have named precisely, but that was in the vicinity of rightness. Gideon fixed things. He continued to fix things. She had understood by now that this was not a nervous habit or a displacement activity, but simply how he was built, that the care he felt for his people and his land expressed itself through maintenance, through attention to the physical structure of the place he'd made. When he replaced a hinge or rehung a gate or patched a section of roof before the winter rains hit it, he was saying something he would not say in words, and she had learned to hear it. She said it back in bread, in suppers that were on the table when he came in the way she kept track of what he was running low on without being asked. In the garden she'd expanded in the spring, which was Nell's in name and management, but which Hester kept alive in the gaps, where Nell's attention went elsewhere, which it frequently did. They were not a smooth household. They disagreed about things with some regularity. Gideon had opinions about how the supply records should be kept that differed from hers, and they had a conversation about that in February that was more pointed than polite, before they arrived at a system that drew from both approaches and satisfied neither entirely, which was how most genuine compromises went. He had a habit, when he was tired and not monitoring himself, of becoming monosyllabic in a way that read as dismissive even when it wasn't, and she had told him so plainly, and he had been quiet about it for a day, and then said she was right and made an effort that was imperfect, but visible and consistent. She still left when she was frightened, in the small ways still became quiet, and inward when something scared her, still retreated to the kitchen and the mechanical comfort of working with her hands rather than saying what was happening. He had learned to see that, and to give her the space, and then, after a reasonable interval, to ask directly. She was learning to answer. Nell turned 5 in February. She turned 5 with the full ceremonial investment of a child who had spent several months becoming an expert on what she wanted and communicating it to the adults around her with great clarity. She wanted the apple cake with the crumble. She wanted star-shaped cookies. She wanted Captain to be present at the table, which was negotiated down to present in the kitchen, which was where he was anyway. She wanted to tell Hester something, she said, but she would tell her later, privately. The later came after the cake and the cookies, and after Gideon had taken Captain back to the barn over the cat's pointed objections, and Nell appeared in the doorway of the kitchen where Hester was cleaning up, still in her birthday dress, with a smear of crumble on her cuff. "I want to tell you the thing," she said. "All right," Hester said. She dried her hands and gave Nell her full attention, because Nell's things deserved full attention. "I used to be scared that if I loved you, it would make me love Mama less," she said. She delivered it with the directness she applied to everything important, not with drama, just the fact of it. But it doesn't. I tested it. Hester looked at her. "How did you test it?" "I thought about Mama this morning, for a long time, and then I thought about you." She paused, searching for the word. They were both still there. Neither of them went away. The thing that moved through Hester's chest at that was not something she had the instruments to measure. She crouched down so she was level with the 5-year-old. "You're right," she said. "That's exactly how it works." "I thought so," Nell said, "but I wanted to make sure." A pause. "Can I still call you Mrs. Bellamy?" Hester considered that. "You can call me whatever you want to call me." "I know," Nell said. "But what do you want?" She had not been prepared for the question to come from that direction. She thought about it seriously, the way Nell thought about serious things, and she said, "Whatever feels true. That's the right name." Nell thought about it for a moment. Then she nodded, in the way she nodded when she'd made a decision she intended to keep. She didn't say what the decision was. She went back out into the house, and Hester heard her in the hallway, asking Gideon where Captain was, and being told he was in the barn, and that he had expressed his feelings about it at some length. The name Nell settled on as the weeks went on was not one name. Moved. Sometimes it was Mrs. Bellamy, in the formal voice she used when she wanted to be taken seriously about something. Sometimes it was Hester, in the distracted way of a child who is talking while focused on something else. Occasionally, in moments that were unguarded, and that Hester never drew attention to, it was Mama, not as a replacement, not as a statement, just as the word that arrived when Nell was not monitoring what she was saying, and the word that came was the right one. Hester never corrected it. She answered as though it were the most natural thing in the world, because it was. Spring came, and the garden came with it bigger than last year, because Nell had expanded her ambitions over the winter and drawn plans on brown paper that were partly aspirational and partly achievable, which was, Hester thought, the correct ratio for a garden plan. The third row, which had produced the mysterious volunteer plant the previous autumn, turned out to be a variety of squash that Clara had apparently planted years ago, whose seeds had persisted in the soil through the winter and emerged on their own terms in their own time. Nell received this information with great satisfaction. "Mama Squash came back," she told Gideon.
He said, "Yeah."
"Looks like it." "Mrs. Bellamy says some things grow when they're ready," Nell said. "Can't make them hurry." Gideon looked at Hester over the top of Nell's head with an expression she had catalogued into her private understanding of him, the expression that meant he was thinking something he was not going to say in words, but that he was saying clearly enough without them. She looked back at him and nodded, slightly because she understood the language now. It was in April, on an ordinary Tuesday, that she became certain about the child she was carrying. She had suspected for several weeks. She had the knowledge that came from having been pregnant, before not the romantic, storybook knowledge, but the specific, physical, unglamorous knowledge that lived in the body. The tiredness that was a different quality of tired. The way certain smells had become complicated. The way her hands went to her middle, sometimes without her directing them there. Most of its windows were dark. She told Gideon on a Tuesday evening, on the porch, which had become the place where they said the things that mattered. She said it directly, the way she said things, without preamble. He went very still, not with alarm, not with any negative thing. Just the stillness of a person absorbing information that is large, and that requires a moment to be fully received. Then he said, "Are you?" and stopped. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said. "Mostly tired." "Good tired or bad tired?" She thought about it. "Different tired," she said. "Familiar, not bad." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fields. She watched him process it, the way his jaw worked slightly, the way his hands rested on his knees with a different quality than usual. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that I'm not going to treat you like something fragile." "Good," she said. "I'm not. I know you're not." He paused. "I also know," he stopped. "Started differently last time. You were alone." She had not told him everything about January. She had told him enough. She did not keep it from him. She was not built for that kind of withholding with people. She trusted, and he had heard it with the specific silence of a man who understands that some things cannot be responded to with words. "I won't be alone this time," she said. He looked at her. Then he reached over and took her hand, the way he'd taken it on their wedding day, not dramatically, just claiming what was his to hold. "No," he said, "you won't." They sat with it for a while. The evening did what evenings did at Ironwillow, coming in slow and orange from the west. "Does Nell know?" he asked. "Not yet. She's going to have opinions," he said. "About the name, mostly," Hester said. "I expect we'll hear about names for the next several months." He made the almost law sound. "What do you want? If it's a girl?" She thought about it. "Something plain," she said. "Something that doesn't need explaining." "And if it's a boy?" She thought about Thomas for a moment, not painfully, not the way she used to think about him, but the way she thought about him now, which was more like a hand on a shoulder. Present, warm, no longer the source of the ache it had been. "Thomas," she said, "if you don't mind." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't mind," he said. "It's a good name." Nell's reaction to the news, delivered the following morning at breakfast, was everything Hester had anticipated and slightly more. She had opinions about the name, as predicted. She had opinions about the room, which she felt should be assessed. She had the opinion that the baby should be a girl, stated not as a preference but as a recommendation, as though the relevant parties were in a position to take direction. "If it's a boy," she said, thinking it through, "he'll probably want to follow me around everywhere." "Probably," Gideon said. "I don't mind," Nell said, with the magnanimity of someone conceding a point. "I'll teach him things." She paused. "Can I teach him how to make the star cookies?" "When he's old enough," Hester said. "How old?" "Old enough to not eat more dough than goes into the cookies." Nell considered whether this criterion applied to her currently, and appeared to decide that it did not strictly, but that this was not the moment to argue it. She went back to her breakfast with the expression of someone who has received complicated news and is integrating it with general goodwill. The pregnancy was not easy in the early months. In the way pregnancies often are not easy. In the early months, the tiredness was real and sometimes heavy, and there were mornings where the kitchen smells were not her friends, which was a particular irony given the life she'd built around those smells. She managed it the way she managed most things, by continuing, by doing the work that was available to do and Steenrentung when the body required it, and not making more of it than it was, while also not making less. Gideon was attentive in the way he was attentive to things practically, through action rather than commentary. He took on parts of the kitchen work in the mornings without discussing the division of labor, simply appearing and doing it, the way he appeared and fixed things. He drove for supplies without being asked. He told the hands, in the flat, informational tone that was his default for everything, that Mrs. Rusk was not to be asked to lift the heavy flour sacks, and that whoever was nearest should handle it, and this was not discussed or questioned. Nell was vigilant in the way of a child who has been given a responsibility she considers significant. She watched Hester with an attention that was occasionally more intense than strictly comfortable, and she offered opinions on what Hester should and should not be doing with the frequency of someone who had decided she had relevant expertise. Where this expertise originated was unclear. When asked, she said simply that she had thought about it. The summer passed. The garden produced. The squash Clara had planted years ago came in abundantly, and Nell treated every squash as a personal vindication. The baking expanded. Hester had been thinking through it for months. The idea she'd had in the earliest days of the arrangement, the one she'd pushed aside because there had been more pressing things. But the thing about an idea that has lodged itself properly is that it does not go away simply because you set it aside. It waits. She started something the ranch. Not formally at first, just word that travelers on the main road could stop at Ironwillow and find bread, and sometimes cookies, and sometimes pie, if the apples were good that week. Then more formally, as the word spread the way, word spread in country like this person to person, along roads, across the specific distances that separated people who nonetheless talked to each other constantly. A sign went up at the end of the ranch road, made by Nell with Gideon's help, painted in the direct and slightly irregular lettering of a 5-year-old who had opinions about fonts. The same Dustmere market that had dismissed the struggling widow and her attended table began sending its travelers past Ironwillow because the travelers had heard about the bread. She noted this without the satisfaction that would have required remembering the pie on the ground, and Ruth Garter's 2 fingers, which she found she thought about less than she would have expected. It was not the kind of vindication that required anyone else to acknowledge they'd been wrong. It was the kind that simply was, regardless. Pete Sully stopped by in August, bought a loaf of bread, and ate a piece of it standing in the yard and said, with the plain simplicity that was his signature, "I knew it." "Knew what?" she asked. That first morning at the market, he said, "When you brought that tin out to the little girl, I knew." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He finished his piece of bread and got back on his horse and rode away. Ruth Garter came in September. Hester saw her from the kitchen window, the same window she'd watched 3 horses arrive from in the confrontation that now felt like it had happened in a different chapter of a different story. She came alone this time. On foot, actually, she'd hitched her wagon at the end of the road and walked up, which Hester noticed because it was a significant gesture from a woman of Ruth's pride. You did not walk up to someone's house. You rode. Walking meant you had come as a private person, not as a representative of anything. She knocked. Hester opened the door. Ruth Garter looked at her. Then she looked at the visible evidence of the pregnancy, which by September was not ambiguous. Then she looked at the house behind Hester, the braided rug Nell had convinced Gideon to buy at the fall market, the painted sign Nell had made that now hung in the kitchen because she had decided it belonged inside. Captain visible in the background, doing what he did, which was occupying the best chair with the air of someone who had paid for it. She said, "I came to," and stopped. "Come in," Hester said. She said it without calculating, without deciding what it cost or what it would produce. Ruth Garter had done something genuinely unkind to her, had worked actively to separate her from a child who needed her, had stood in public and said things that were designed to damage. All of that was true. It was also true that the woman standing in her doorway had walked up on foot, which meant she had wanted to say something badly enough to submit to the small humiliation of arriving without the armor of her usual position. Hester stepped aside. Ruth came in. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Nell sorted apples and drawn on brown paper and eaten the first full meals of her recovery. Hester put the kettle on because she put the kettle on when people sat at her table, and that was simply what was done. Ruth looked at the kitchen, at the room that had been cold and still the first morning, and that was now the opposite of those things in every way. She looked at the garden through the window, at the squash coming in on the vine. She looked at the cup of tea Hester set in front of her. "I was wrong," she said. She said it the way some people say hard things quickly, like removing a splinter, because saying it slowly would have allowed fear to intervene. "About you. About the situation, I was wrong." Hester sat down across from her. "I know," she said. "I want to say that I thought I was thinking of the child," Ruth said. "And I believe some of it was that. But some of it," she paused. Her hands were around the cup. Her hands, Hester noticed, were older than the rest of her seemed. The hands of someone who had worked for a long time. Some of it was that you didn't fit the picture I had of how things should go. And that made me, she stopped. It made me not careful. Hester looked at her. This was not the Ruth Garter she had squared off with in this yard and at the dry goods counter. This was someone older and less armored, and Hester did not know exactly what had brought her here or what it had cost, and she found she did not need to know. "You knocked my pie on the ground," Hester said. "I know," Ruth said. "I know I did. That was a hard week," Hester said. "That pie was most of what I had for flour." Ruth looked at the table. Something moved in her face. "I'm not telling you to make you feel bad," Hester said. "I'm telling you because it was true, and I'd like it said out loud, and then I'd like to put it away." Ruth looked up at her. "That's more generous than I deserve." "Probably," Hester said. "But I'm going to have a baby in the winter, and I'd rather not spend the months before it carrying things I've decided I don't want to carry." Something shifted in Ruth's face, not dramatically. Just the small, real shift of a woman who has been spoken to honestly and is receiving it. "Is there anything?" She stopped, started differently. "Is there anything I can do? That would be useful." Hester thought about it. "Nell will need help sometimes," she said. "In the winter, when I have less capacity. She likes having things to do, and she likes being treated like someone who has useful opinions." "She does have useful opinions," Ruth said, with the faint, surprised quality of someone admitting something they hadn't expected to admit. "She's 4 going on 40, Hester said. "You have to take her seriously, or she'll know you're not." Corner of Ruth's mouth moved, not a full smile. The beginning of one. Ruth Garter came back, not constantly, not with the reforming energy of someone who has decided to become a different person and would like recognition for it. She came practically, she brought things. Occasionally she helped with Nell when Hester's circumstances made the physical work of chasing a 5-year-old more complicated. She did not make anything of any of it. Nell accepted her with the pragmatic openness of a child who has decided that the landscape of her life contains certain people and has allocated them appropriately. She never knocked the pie off the table again, which was all Hester required. The baby came in January, not on the anniversary, 4 days before, which meant Hester spent the last days of the old year in the particular suspended state of someone who is waiting for something enormous and cannot make it hurry. She was not afraid in the way she had been afraid. Before she was afraid, in the honest, appropriate way of someone who understands what is coming and respects it, which is different from the kind of fear that comes from being alone. She was not alone. Gideon did not leave the house for the 3 days preceding the birth in a way that he did not discuss. But that was simply present. He found things to do indoors, near available. Nell had been informed of the general situation and had prepared herself for it with characteristic thoroughness. She had questions, which she asked with the directness she applied to everything, and Hester answered them. The way she answered Nell's questions directly, at the appropriate level, without condescension. The baby was a girl. She came loudly and with considerable difficulty, and she was, when she arrived, red and furious, and fully herself, in a way that new people are sometimes fully themselves, from the very first moment, and Hester held her in the first minutes with the specific gravity of someone who has been given back, something they thought they had lost forever. She did not name her after anything. She named her Margaret because it was plain and strong and did not need explaining. Gideon held her for the first time with the hands of a man who had held a small person before and knew the weight of it and was not frightened by it, and his face did the thing it rarely did. It opened, completely, without the usual management. He looked at Hester over the baby's head, and the look between them was not a performance and not a calculation. It was just the two of them, in the room where they had been through several kinds of difficult on the other side of it. Nell looked at Margaret with the appraising eye of someone conducting an evaluation. "She's small," she said. "You were small once," Gideon said. "I don't remember it," Nell said. She reached out one careful finger and touched Margaret's hand, which closed around it with the automatic grip of a new person encountering the world. Nell's face did something that Hester would remember for a long time, the expression of someone being surprised by their own feeling, being caught off guard by how large it was. "Hi," Nell said to the baby softly. Just that. Margaret's grip did not loosen. 6 months later, Ironwillow was the place it had been becoming since the morning Hester had first driven down that road in the dark, with her recipe tin and her doubt and her terrible certainty that she was probably the wrong person for whatever was being asked of her. The barns were sound. The north pasture had rested through the winter and come back productive. The hand who had quit had been replaced by a young man named Eli, who was competent and quiet and had, without anyone planning it, become the person Nell addressed most of her barn cat concerns to, which she had many of. The baking business had grown into something real, not large. Not more than she could manage, but real, with a small regular income that was hers specifically, that did not belong to the household ledger, but to the tin she kept on the high shelf, the one that had held recipes and now held something else. She had kept that tin through everything, through Thomas and January, and the room above the tannery and the market table, and the Saturday Gideon had ridden in with his daughter who would not eat. It had traveled with her every time she moved, and it was on the shelf in the kitchen of Ironwillow now, worn at the corners, the paint on the lid gone to almost nothing. She looked at it sometimes when she was working, not for any reason she could have articulated. Just looked at it the way you look at things that have been with you, long enough to constitute a kind of continuity. One Sunday morning, in the early summer, she was making pancakes. This had become, without any formal declaration, a Sunday tradition, the particular tradition that Nell had once shared with her mother, pancakes on Sunday morning, which Nell had mentioned once in the early weeks and which Hester had absorbed and never commented on and simply made a feature of their Sundays. It was not a complicated thing. Pancakes, the same every week. But Nell would come downstairs on Sunday mornings with the specific bright-eyed quality of things, with the specific bright-eyed into of someone who noggin and is happy about it, and that quality was worth more than anything complicated. Gideon was at the stove. He was managing the heat the way she'd taught him, not just following instructions, but actually managing it, which was a distinction that mattered, and he had gotten it right more often than not in the past several months, and occasionally complimented himself on this with the understated self-satisfaction of a man who has learned a new skill and is pleased about it. Nell's was stirring the batter, which she did with great vigor, and a certain disregard for spillage. Margaret was in the chair positioned, so she could see the kitchen because she'd made it clear, in the wordless but emphatic way of 7-month-old people, that she expected to be included in whatever was happening, and they had all learned to include her. Captain was on the counter, which he was not meant to be on, and everyone had decided some time ago that the energy required to enforce this rule was not worth the result. So he sat there with the air of a cat who has won a long war and is gracious in victory. Hester stood at the counter and watched her family. She watched Nell stir with excessive enthusiasm, and Gideon manage the heat with quiet pride, and Margaret bang a wooden spoon against the side of her chair, and Captain perform the dignified disengagement of a cat who is above breakfast and also would like some. She was a woman who had lost a husband and a son and had lived in a room above a tannery counting coins that never added up. She had been knocked down in a public square and talked about in dry goods stores, and had once made the specific human mistake of leaving in the dark before anyone was awake, because she was afraid of what staying would cost. She was also a woman who had sat down on a market square floor and held out a star-shaped cookie with the patience of someone who had learned at great personal expense that you cannot make wounded things come to you. You can only make yourself available and wait and trust that when they are ready, they will reach. She thought about that sometimes, about how the whole of it had hinged on a cookie and a willingness to crouch down and not watch and not push and just be present. She was not a hero of the story the way people liked, to shape stories, arriving with answers, transforming everything through the force of goodness. She had been frightened and she had left and she had come back and she had been wrong about some things and had said so's and had stayed. Anyway, that was the whole of it. That was, she had come to understand enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, the only way anything real got built, not through perfection or the absence of fear, but through the decision to come back, to sit down, to wait. Nell looked up from the batter. Ready. Hester checked the consistency with the spoon she'd been holding. Almost, a little more. Nell stirred more. Did Clara make pancakes this thick? She asked it the way she asked these questions, now not with grief, not with the careful caution of someone testing whether the topic was permitted, but with simple curiosity, the way you ask about someone who is part of your story. Gideon looked up from the stove. He thought about it. Thicker, he said. She always made them too thick. They'd be raw in the middle, and she'd say that was how she liked them. Nell made a face. Raw in the middle is bad, I know, he said. I ate a lot of them anyway. Nell considered this information and incorporated it into her private understanding of Clara with the same seriousness she incorporated everything. Then she looked at Hester. Yours are better, she said. She stopped, navigating the things she was trying to say with the effort of someone who wants to be accurate. I mean, the pancakes are better. Not, I know what you mean, Hester said. Both things can be true, Nell said. She had been saying this lately. Both things can be true with the satisfaction of someone who has discovered a principle they find broadly applicable. Yes, Hester said, they can. She poured the first ladle of batter onto the pan and listened to it settle and begin to cook. Outside, through the window, Ironwillow stretched in the morning sun, the fields running green to the fence line, the repaired barn standing solid, the garden coming in along the east wall. In the third row, the squash was already climbing. Inside, her family made noise of various kinds, the ordinary percussion of a morning that had nowhere particular to be and was in no hurry to get there. Hester watched the pancake and waited for the bubbles that would tell her it was time to turn it. She had learned, in all the ways a person learns things badly first, and then better, that this was how most things worked. You watched. You waited for the signal. You turned it at the right moment, not before. She turned it. It was exactly right.